Hey, welcome back, my friend. Or maybe, welcome for the very first time. Either way, I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine this. You open your fridge right now, and it is gone. Not broken, not empty, gone. There is no fridge. There is no grocery store down the street. There is no pizza delivery, no drive-through, no frozen dinner. There is just you, your family, and whatever the land around your house decided to give you this season. Now imagine that is not a nightmare. That is just Tuesday. That was the reality for most Americans in the 1800s. And honestly, some of what they did to survive will absolutely blow your mind. Because before the modern world handed us the miracle of a perfectly stocked refrigerator, people were doing things to feed their families that were both incredibly clever and sometimes terrifyingly dangerous. And tonight, we're going to walk right into their kitchens, or rather their hearths, and see exactly how they lived. This is a story about salt, smoke, and seasons, about a world where your dinner depended not on your wallet but on the weather, and about the moment everything changed. Forever. Now, before we dive in, if this kind of slow, story-filled journey through history is something that helps you unwind at the end of a long day, I would love it if you took just a second to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Not because I am asking you to do it as a favour, but because if this is the kind of content that genuinely makes your evenings feel a little softer and a little more interesting, then you and I are going to have a long and wonderful time together here. Drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you watching this right now, and what time is it? I always love knowing who is on the other side of the screen. Now, let us turn the lights down low, let the world outside go quiet, and let tonight's story begin. Let us start with a number that I want you to sit with for a moment. 90%. In the year 1790, when the very first official census of the United States was taken, approximately 90% of all working Americans listed their occupation as one single word: farmer. Not banker, not lawyer, not store clerk. Farmer. 9 out of every 10 people you would have met on an American street, in an American village, walking down an American country road. They were growing their own food. They were raising their own animals. They were living and dying by what the soil gave them. Now fast forward to today, less than 2% of Americans work in agriculture. 2%. And yet somehow that 2% feeds the other 98, and then some. That gap, that extraordinary shift happened mostly because of a chain of inventions and discoveries that unfolded during the 1800s. And once you understand what life was like before those inventions arrived, you will never look at your refrigerator, your grocery store, or your kitchen the same way again. So let us go back. Let us go all the way back to a morning in, say, 1820. The sun has just barely crept over the horizon. Somewhere in rural Ohio, or Virginia, or Pennsylvania, or any one of dozens of American states where most people still live on farms, a family is waking up. The father has probably already been outside for an hour. The mother is moving around a kitchen that looks nothing like yours. There is no stove in the modern sense. There is no oven with a dial you can turn. There is a fireplace, a large stone-framed fireplace, and it is the centre of everything. Not just the warmth, everything. Cooking happened on that hearth. You roasted meat by hanging it over the fire on an iron hook. You boiled your soups and stews in heavy cast-iron pots that sat directly in the flames. You baked bread by burying a cast-iron Dutch oven in the hot coals and shoveling more coals on top of the lid. And if you wanted to make a sauce at a lower temperature, you learned to read the fire. You learned which part of the flame was hotter, which part was gentler. The fire was your only appliance. and mastering it was a full-time skill. A good cook of the 1800s was described as needing not just recipes, but extraordinary senses. She needed sharp sight to judge the colour of a crust, sharp smell to catch the moment something was burning, sharp hearing to tell the difference between a gentle simmer and a dangerous boil, and all of this while managing 4 or 5 different pots at the same time, over a fire she'd built herself from scratch that morning. And now here is something that stops most people when they hear it. Food preparation in the early 1800s was not considered a task. It was not a chore you squeezed in between meetings. It was the job. The full-time, dawn to dusk, every single day of the year job. Historians who have studied domestic life in this period estimate that preparing, cooking, and preserving food took up the single largest portion of a woman's working hours, more than sewing, more than cleaning, more than childcare, more than almost everything else combined. Think about what that means. The modern world has given us the extraordinary luxury of thinking about food for maybe 30 minutes a day, deciding what to eat, opening a package, stirring something in a pan. 200 years ago, food was not a 30-minute thought. It was the architecture of your entire day. The family planned its schedule around meals, not the other way around. And the meals themselves? They did not look like ours. Here is something that surprises almost everyone. In the early 1800s, the biggest meal of the day was not dinner in the evening. It was a meal called dinner, served at midday in the early afternoon. The evening meal was called supper, and it was much smaller, much lighter. A bowl of porridge, some bread with milk, maybe leftover apple pie. In one region of the mid-Atlantic states, a typical breakfast, eaten after several hours of outdoor farm work, might include coffee, cold leftover turkey from the day before, fried hominy, which is a kind of cooked corn dish, and something called beer thickened with wheat flour. Which, yes, you read that correctly, beer for breakfast, thickened with wheat flour. For farming families doing hard physical labour in the cold morning air, caloric density mattered far more than what we might call a balanced diet today. And that midday dinner? It might be sausage and dried pumpkins, pig's feet with turnips, beans cooked in butter, or a simple boiled pot of salt beef with cabbage. Whatever the family happened to have on hand, thrown into the big pot over the fire and cooked until everything was soft. There were no recipes in the modern sense. There was no measuring cup, no teaspoon, no oven thermometer. There was experience, there was instinct, and there was an intimate understanding of the food itself that most of us have completely lost. Now let me give you one more piece of context before we get into the heart of tonight's story, because this piece changes everything. When we talk about eating in the 1800s, we're not talking about one America. We're talking about many Americas living inside the same century. There was the farming family in New England, waking up before dawn to tend their 50-acre plot. There was the wealthy Virginia planter eating 5-course dinners off imported English china, with enslaved people doing every single piece of labour in the kitchen. There was the immigrant worker in a growing northeastern city, buying bread from a street cart because he had no kitchen of his own. There was the pioneer family on the Ohio frontier, eating whatever they could hunt, grow, or barter from their neighbours. And there was the enslaved person on a southern plantation, surviving on whatever rations were allocated to them, often corn, salt pork, and very little else. Food in the 1800s was not just sustenance, it was status, it was geography, it was survival, and for millions of people, it was the single most urgent question of every single day. What are we going to eat, and where is it going to come from? And here is the thing. There was no answer to that question that came in a package. No answer that came from a store shelf 3 miles down the road. The answer came from the ground beneath your feet, from the animals in your yard, from the neighbours you could barter with, and from a set of ancient, brilliant, and sometimes desperate techniques for making food last longer than nature intended. Those techniques, salt, smoke, cellars, fermentation, ice, and eventually an extraordinary invention that a French chef invented specifically because Napoleon Bonaparte asked him to. Those techniques are what kept humanity fed for centuries, and they are exactly where our story goes next. Because once you understand how people kept food alive without a refrigerator, you will start to see the world around you very differently. You will look at a jar of pickles and see 1,000 years of human ingenuity. You will look at a piece of smoked salmon and understand exactly why it exists. And you will look at that humming box in your kitchen, the one you open 12 times a day without thinking, and feel something close to awe. The full picture of what people ate, how they got it, how they kept it, and what it cost them. That story is just getting started. But before we get to the smoke and the salt and the ancient art of making food last, we need to spend some time with the single most powerful force that controlled every meal on every table in the 1800s. Something that no amount of money, cleverness, or hard work could fully overcome. Something that modern life has almost made us forget entirely. And it is something as old as the earth itself. The calendar. In part 2, we're going to talk about what it actually meant to eat by the seasons, not as a charming lifestyle trend, the way some farm-to-table restaurant might describe it today, but as a hard, sometimes brutal reality that shaped every single bite of food that went into people's mouths, and the story of one particular season in one particular country that ended in the deaths of over 1 million people, because one single crop failed. That story is coming up right now. There is a word in the Irish language, an gortamór, that does not translate cleanly into English. The closest you can get is the Great Hunger, but even that does not quite capture it. Because hunger, as a word, suggests something temporary, something you feel before lunch or after skipping breakfast. And gortamór was something else entirely. It was a hunger that lasted years, a hunger that swallowed an entire civilization whole. And it began, as so many catastrophes in history do, not with war, not with politics, not with anything dramatic at all, but with a plant, a single plant, one crop, one variety of potato known as the Irish lumper that had quietly become the foundation of survival for nearly half the population of Ireland. I want to sit with that number for a second, because it tells you everything you need to understand about what food meant in the 1800s, and what happened when the season turned against you. By the early 1840s, Ireland had a population of approximately 8.5 million people. 2/3 of them depended on agriculture for their survival. And among the poorest farmers, those tenant families squeezed onto tiny plots of land between 1 and 5 acres, the potato was not simply a food, it was the food. Historians have estimated that a typical family in the Irish countryside consumed somewhere around 8 pounds of potatoes per person per day. 8 pounds. That single crop provided 80% or more of everything they ate. Now you might think, well, that sounds fragile. How could an entire society let itself become so dependent on one thing? And that is a fair question. But here is the answer that most people do not know, and it genuinely surprised me the first time I encountered it. The potato was, in many ways, a miracle food for the poor. It was extraordinarily nutritious. It grew well in poor soil. It could be cultivated on a small plot of land with basic tools, and it produced more calories per acre than almost any grain crop available at the time. For a family living on a few acres, with very little money, very little power, and very little choice, the potato was not an act of laziness or ignorance. It was the smartest possible solution to an almost impossible situation. The problem was not the potato itself. The problem was what happens when the calendar turns and the one thing you are counting on simply does not come. Let us talk about the calendar. Because in the 1800s, whether you were in Ireland, in Virginia, in Ohio, or in the Scottish Highlands, the calendar was not just a way of tracking time. It was the master document of your entire life. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, how much you would have, and whether your family would make it through to spring. Think about what that actually means in practice. Spring arrived in America and Europe with something that felt almost like relief. After months of eating what you had managed to preserve, salted pork, dried beans, stored root vegetables slowly going soft in the cellar, the ground finally began to give again. The first green things pushed through the soil. Wild greens appeared on hillsides. Dandelion leaves, which most of us today treat as weeds to be poisoned, were eagerly collected and eaten, not for a trendy salad, but because they were the first fresh thing that had touched a family's lips in months. Farmers planted their kitchen gardens. Children were sent to pick berries from hedgerows and wild strawberries from meadow edges. Summer was abundance, relative abundance anyway. Fresh vegetables came in waves: corn, beans, squash, tomatoes. Fruit ripened on trees and vines. Chickens produced eggs more reliably in the longer days. Fish ran in the rivers. Hunting was easier. There was a rhythm to it, almost musical. Each week bringing something new, something that tasted like life itself after the grey monotony of winter food. And then autumn arrived, and the whole machinery of survival kicked into overdrive. Autumn was not a relaxed season. It was not apple picking and cosy sweaters and pumpkin spice the way we have reinvented it today. Autumn in the 1800s was a race, a full-tilt, every able-bodied person working from dawn to dusk race against the coming cold. Because everything that would feed your family from November through April had to be harvested, processed, and stored before the first hard frost. The hog, that essential, unglamorous creature of the American farm, was raised all spring and summer for a reason. He was fed the scraps, the corn husks, the kitchen waste, everything that would otherwise rot. And then in late fall, when the temperatures finally dropped enough to prevent meat from spoiling during butchering, the whole community would gather for what Southerners called, with absolutely no sentimentality, hog killin' time. Hams were salted for a month. Fat was rendered into lard. Sausages were made. Hocks and feet were pickled in vinegar brine. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was wasted. Root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, beets, parsnips, carrots, were carried down into the root cellar, packed carefully in damp sand or straw to slow their decay. Apples were stored in barrels. Onions were plaited together and hung from the rafters. Pumpkins could last for months on a cool, dry shelf. Winter squash, too. Herbs were dried in bundles near the hearth. Corn was stripped from the cob and dried. Beans were shelled and put up in cloth sacks. And all of this, every single jar and barrel and dried bundle, represented a calculation. An estimate of how many months stood between the last harvest and the first spring planting. How many mouths needed feeding? How much could be traded or bartered away? And how much had to be kept back for the family itself? Get the calculation wrong, and by February you were eating thin soup made from boiled bones that had already been boiled 3 times before. Now here is the part that I think people today genuinely struggle to imagine, because we have so thoroughly insulated ourselves from it. The seasons did not just shape what people ate, they shaped how people felt, deeply, psychologically. Winter, for a farming family in the 1800s, was a season of real anxiety. Not the vague background anxiety of modern life, but a concrete, specific daily worry about whether the food would last. By January, the freshest items from the fall harvest were long gone. You were eating what you had preserved. The same salt pork, the same dried beans, the same root vegetables week after week. Historians who have studied the cookbooks and household records of the period note that midwinter menus had a sameness to them that we would find almost impossible today. And then spring would come, and with it, joy. Real, physical, grateful joy. A joy tied directly to food. The kind of joy that comes from eating something fresh and green after months of brown and salt. We have a phrase in modern English, spring fever. Most of us use it to mean a vague restlessness, a desire to open the windows and take a walk. But its original meaning was almost the opposite. Spring fever, in the 18th and 19th centuries, described a very real physical condition, a kind of exhaustion, sometimes accompanied by weakness and skin problems, that came from spending an entire winter eating a diet almost completely devoid of fresh fruits and vegetables, what we now recognize as the early symptoms of vitamin deficiency. The body's own way of telling you that the season had gone on long enough, and it was time for something alive to eat. But if you want to understand what it truly meant to be at the mercy of the calendar, the full, devastating cost of a season that turned against you, then you have to go back to Ireland in the autumn of 1845. The potato blight that arrived in Ireland that year did not come from Europe. Scientists, after more than a century of research, traced its origin to a strain of water mold that had been quietly destroying crops in Mexico and the United States for several years before it crossed the Atlantic, likely aboard a ship carrying seed potatoes. In 1845, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Ireland's potato fields were destroyed. People were hungry, but they held on. The government offered some limited relief. Many families hoped the next year would be better. It was not. In 1846, 3/4 of the harvest was lost. And now here is the detail that, to me, transforms this from a historical tragedy into something almost unbearable to contemplate. During those same years, the years when 1 million Irish men, women and children died of starvation and disease, ships continued to leave Irish ports carrying food, grain, livestock, butter, peas, beans, food that was grown in Ireland, that belonged to British landlords, that was loaded onto vessels and sailed to England while the people who had grown it lay dying. One historian of the period documented that in 1845 alone, the first year of the famine, over 3 million quarters of corn were exported from Ireland to England. That same year, 257,000 sheep were shipped out. There are accounts of ships arriving in Irish harbours laden with imports passing, ships departing with full cargo holds. The Irish revolutionary writer John Mitchell captured it with one of the most searing sentences I have ever read about food and power. He wrote that God had sent the potato blight, but that the English had created the famine. The Irish population fell from 8.5 million in 1844 to 6.5 million by 1851. 1 million died, 2 million fled, to the United States, to Canada, to Australia. And even today, more than 170 years later, the population of the island of Ireland has never returned to what it was before the blight. I tell you this not to dwell in darkness, but because I think this story is the key to understanding everything that comes after it. Every root cellar ever dug, every barrel of salt pork ever packed, every jar of pickled vegetables ever sealed. All of it was an answer to this fundamental, ancient, terrifying question. What do you do when the season does not give you what you need? And the answers that people found before the modern world handed us refrigerators and global supply chains were genuinely extraordinary. Brilliant, creative, sometimes dangerous, and often delicious. There is one particular answer that is older than civilization itself, practiced in ancient Egypt, in Rome, on the Great Plains of America, in every kitchen in every farmhouse in the 1800s. That is so simple and so effective and so deeply woven into the food you eat right now today that you almost certainly have some version of it in your kitchen at this exact moment. It has no glamour. It has no fancy equipment. It requires no skill beyond patience and knowledge of a single, inexpensive, ancient substance. And that substance, along with fire and smoke and one very clever French chef, is exactly where our story heads next. Because before canning, before refrigeration, before any of the technologies we take for granted, there was salt and smoke and the quiet genius of people who had spent centuries learning to make food outlast the season that produced it. The methods they developed are older than the written word, and some of them, if you had tried them without the right knowledge, could kill you just as surely as starvation. The line between preservation and poison, it turns out, was extremely fine, and walking it required knowledge that was passed down not in books, but in the hands and memory of every woman who stood over a hearth and knew, from instinct, from teaching, from hard experience, exactly how much salt was enough. That story is just a breath away. Salt is such an ordinary thing now that you probably do not give it a second thought. It sits in a little shaker on your kitchen table. You knock it over sometimes and toss a pinch over your shoulder, not because you believe in superstitions, but because you saw someone else do it once and it stuck. You use it to season pasta water, to rim a cocktail glass, to bring out the sweetness in a piece of chocolate if you have ever tried that combination. But here is what most people do not know. For the vast majority of human history, the stuff in that little shaker was more valuable than most things you own. It was traded weight for weight against gold in parts of West Africa. It built entire cities. It funded empires. It caused wars. And in the Roman Empire, soldiers received a portion of their pay specifically so they could buy it. A practice so essential to military life that it gave us, centuries later, the word we still use for a paycheck. The word salary comes from sal, the Latin word for salt. That is how important this mineral was. And in the 1800s, on every farm, in every smokehouse, in every kitchen from New England to the American frontier, salt was still the single most powerful weapon a family had against the one enemy that threatened their survival more than any other. Not winter, not drought, not even war, rot. Let me explain what actually happens to food when it is left alone, because I think understanding the enemy makes the solution so much more elegant. Everything we eat, every piece of meat, every vegetable, every fish, every fruit, begins to decay the moment it is separated from the living organism that produced it. The agents of that decay are microorganisms, bacteria mostly, along with molds and yeasts. They are invisible, they are everywhere, and they are extremely efficient. They need a few things to do their work: warmth and moisture, most importantly. Take away one of those things, and their progress slows. Take away both, and it stops almost entirely. Salt does something almost miraculous in this context. When you pack food in salt, really saturate it, surround it, the salt draws moisture out of the food through a process called osmosis. It essentially desiccates the meat or fish from the outside in, removing the water that bacteria need to survive. A well-salted piece of pork could last for months in conditions where an unsalted piece would be inedible within days, and people understood this, not in the language of microbiology, because that field did not exist yet, but through deep empirical knowledge passed down through generations. The farmers of the 1800s did not know what bacteria were. They just knew, with absolute certainty, that meat packed in salt lasted. Meat that was not packed in salt did not, and that practical knowledge was worth more to a family's survival than almost anything written in any book. What did the salt curing process actually look like in practice? Because there is something almost meditative about it when you sit down and think through the steps. After the November or December hog slaughter, that communal gathering that so many southern families called hog killing time, the various cuts of meat were carried into the salt house or the cold cellar. The hams, the shoulders, the sides that would become bacon. They were packed in tubs of coarse salt and left there for approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks, during which the salt was slowly, steadily pulling the water out of the flesh, replacing the moisture that bacteria needed with a crystalline mineral shield. Then came the second step. The salt-cured meat was carried to the smokehouse. Let me tell you about the smokehouse for a moment, because I think it is one of the most underappreciated structures in American history. It was typically a small wooden building. Records from colonial Virginia describe them as usually around 8 to 14 feet square, with a steeply pitched roof designed to trap and hold smoke. There were no windows. The only opening was a single heavy door and narrow slits near the roofline to regulate airflow. It was dark inside, close, and smelled of centuries of layered smoke. A fire was built on the dirt floor, not a roaring fire, not flames, but a slow, smouldering fire, generating dense smoke rather than heat. Hardwood specifically, hickory in the American South and Midwest, oak and maple in New England, alder in the Pacific Northwest, and in parts of Northern Europe. The choice of wood was not random, it was deeply practical. Different woods produced different chemical compounds in their smoke, and those compounds had different effects on the meat. Here is the part that I find genuinely astonishing, and that the farmers of the 1800s did not know but were benefiting from every single day. Wood smoke contains more than 300 individual chemical compounds. Among them are phenols, natural antioxidants that slow the rancidification of fat, and organic acids, including formaldehyde and acetic acid, which create an environment on the surface of the meat that is hostile to bacterial growth. Scientists who study food chemistry describe smoke as creating what they call an antimicrobial barrier around the surface of the cured meat. The smoke was not just adding flavour, it was actively fighting the invisible organisms that wanted to destroy the food, and the farmers knew none of this. They just knew it worked, and they had known it for thousands of years. Have you ever stopped to wonder why bacon tastes the way it does? Why smoked salmon has that particular depth that no other preparation of fish can quite replicate? Why a properly cured country ham from a Virginia farm tastes completely different from anything that comes shrink-wrapped out of a factory? The answer is time and wood and salt acting together in a process that took human civilization thousands of years to perfect. The smoked hams of the American South, the Fin and Haddie of Scotland, the prosciutto of Italy, the Westphalian ham of Germany, all of these are direct descendants of the same ancient pre-scientific understanding of how to use salt and smoke to cheat time itself. And here is the beautiful irony of it. What began as pure necessity, the desperate need to make food last through a winter to preserve the results of months of labour, became, over centuries, an art. The specific wood chosen, the duration of the smoking, the ratio of salt to spice in the curing mixture, the temperature of the smokehouse, all of these became matters of craft, of regional tradition, of personal pride. The smokehouse, which began as a survival tool, became something closer to a kitchen. A slow, quiet, fragrant kitchen that took weeks to produce its results. Now there is something I want to say here that I think is honest and worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to romanticize these old methods. We look at a 19th century smokehouse and see rustic craftsmanship. We look at salt-cured ham and see artisanal tradition. And there is genuine beauty in both of those things. I am not going to pretend otherwise, but the reality for a working family in the 1800s was that salt was heavy and expensive and sometimes hard to get. The Civil War, which disrupted salt supply chains across the American South so effectively that the Union deliberately targeted Confederate salt works as a military strategy, created salt shortages that left families struggling to preserve food for winter. The Confederacy understood, as armies throughout history had understood, that an enemy deprived of salt was an enemy weakened in ways that went far beyond the battlefield, and the smokehouse, for all its quiet romance, required constant management. You could not walk away from a smouldering fire for days at a time in an enclosed wooden building without risk. If the smoke got too hot, it would cook the meat rather than cure it. Too cold, and the antimicrobial effect was insufficient. There was a narrow range of temperature and humidity that produced genuinely preserved, long-lasting meat, and learning to hit that range consistently was a skill acquired not in a classroom but over years of practice, failure, and careful watching. Get it wrong in June, with warm temperatures already threatening the stability of the preserved meat, and your family's protein supply for the winter could be gone in days. There was also a third method that ran alongside salt and smoke, one that modern food culture has almost completely recast as a trendy health habit, when in fact it was also ancient, also practical, and also rooted in the same fundamental science as everything else: fermentation. Fermentation was not invented. It was discovered, probably by accident on a day that no one recorded, when someone left something out a little too long and found that instead of rotting, it had transformed. Grain that got wet and sat in warmth became something that smelled strange but tasted good and made people feel pleasantly hazy, which was essentially the discovery of beer. Milk left in the right conditions curdled into something that lasted far longer than fresh milk and developed a sharpness and richness all its own, which was in essence the discovery of cheese. By the 1800s, fermentation was one of the most important preservation tools in the American and European kitchen, not as a conscious science, but as an inherited tradition of recipes and techniques that had been handed down so long that no one could remember their origin. Sauerkraut in German-American households, pickled cucumbers throughout the Northeast, fermented corn in parts of the South, vinegar-preserved vegetables, fruits, even some meats. The acidity produced by fermentation created the same hostile environment for bacteria as salt and smoke, just through a different chemical mechanism. A German immigrant family in Ohio in the 1840s might have had crocks of sauerkraut fermenting in the cellar, alongside barrels of salt pork and racks of smoked sausages, a multi-layered preservation strategy that reflected not just practical knowledge but centuries of culinary heritage transplanted across an ocean. And so here is what I want you to hold in your mind as this piece of the story begins to close. When you open your refrigerator tonight, when you reach for a piece of bacon, or a wedge of aged cheese, or a jar of pickles, or a slice of smoked salmon, you're touching something very old, something that has salt in it, or smoke in it, or the memory of fermentation in its flavour. Something whose existence is a direct inheritance from the thousands of years of human ingenuity that stood between hunger and survival. The refrigerator did not replace those methods, it supplemented them, and in the process it obscured them, made them invisible, turned them from necessities into novelties. But the intelligence behind them is still there, in every piece of prosciutto, in every bite of sharp cheddar, in every jar of sour pickles. That intelligence belonged to the women who stood in cold October cellars packing tubs of salt. To the men who built smokehouses and tended slow fires through November nights, to the generations of families who understood, in their hands and in their memories, that the difference between eating well in February and starving in February was not luck. It was knowledge, specific, hard-won, precious knowledge that they guarded and passed on with exactly the seriousness it deserved. But salt and smoke could only take you so far. There was still the question of summer, of the warm months when no amount of salting could prevent a carcass from spoiling within hours, when the root cellar lost its chill and the smokehouse became a liability rather than a resource. How did people keep anything cold, truly, dangerously cold, in a world without electricity? The answer turns out to involve frozen lakes, a very clever Boston merchant, a global trade empire, and one of the strangest business stories of the 19th century. A man who figured out that ice, which most people considered worthless, because where he lived it simply appeared every winter for free, was actually worth a fortune. If only you could get it somewhere it did not exist. That story, and the extraordinary underground structures that people built to hold the cold, the root cellars, the ice houses, the engineering of cold itself in a pre-electric world, is exactly where we are headed right now. Picture this for a moment. It is the summer of 1833. A ship is rounding the tip of South Africa, somewhere in the vast blue heart of the Indian Ocean, baking under equatorial heat. The crew is sweating through their shirts. The air below decks is thick and close, and in the hold, packed in sawdust sealed behind thick wooden walls, sit 180 tons of ice. Frozen Massachusetts pond ice, cut from fresh pond in Cambridge just a few months before, in the middle of a New England winter. The ship is called the Tuscany. Its destination is Calcutta, India, 16,000 miles from Boston, a voyage of 4 months. And when local Indian merchants saw it pulling into the harbour on the Ganges River that September, many of them genuinely believed it was a joke. Because the idea that solid blocks of ice could survive a 4-month ocean journey across the equator and arrive in India, was so absurd that respectable people assumed it was simply not possible. And yet when the cargo hold was opened, 100 tons of the ice was still intact. The man who made that voyage happen was 33 years old at the time. He had already gone bankrupt. He had spent time in debtor's prison, 3 separate times actually. He had been chased down the streets of Boston by men he owed money to, and he had kept going anyway, with the stubborn, almost irrational conviction that a substance most people considered completely worthless, because in New England it literally appeared in your yard every winter for free, was actually one of the most valuable commodities on earth. His name was Frederick Tudor, and the story of how he turned frozen pond water into a global empire is, I think, one of the most extraordinary business stories in American history, and one of the most important chapters in the story of how people fed themselves before the modern world arrived. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because it starts with a moment that is almost comically humble. In the summer of 1805, 2 brothers from a wealthy Boston family were sitting at a picnic. The family was prosperous enough to enjoy one of the great luxuries of the era, chilled drinks. Ice was harvested from ponds each winter and stored in insulated buildings called ice houses, packed in sawdust to slow the melting. For wealthy New England families, summer ice was an extraordinary pleasure in a world without refrigeration. One of the brothers, Frederick, 22 years old, Harvard dropout, restless and ambitious, looked at the ice in his glass and had a thought that was either genius or madness. Probably both, honestly. He thought, people in the Caribbean have never tasted anything cold in their lives. They live in places where the temperature never drops below 60 degrees. They have no ice, no way of making ice, no concept of what a chilled drink feels like on a sweltering afternoon. What if I brought ice to them? What if I took something that cost nothing here, something that falls from the sky every winter, and sold it to people who had never seen it? His brother laughed. Most of Boston laughed. The Boston Gazette, reporting on his first voyage in February of 1806, ran the following line, and I have to share this with you because it is just perfect. No joke, a vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation. It was, in fact, a slippery speculation. Tudor loaded his ship with roughly 130 tons of ice, sailed it to Martinique in the West Indies, and arrived to find that he had made two critical errors. First, a significant portion of the ice had melted during the 3-week voyage because he had not yet figured out the right insulation. Second, and this is the one that really stings, there were no ice houses in Martinique. No one there had ever stored ice before. The locals had nowhere to put it. Tudor reportedly suggested they take the ice home and wrap it in blankets. I am not making that up. He lost $4,500 on that first trip, which was a significant amount of money in 1806. Here is what separates Frederick Tudor from most people who fail once and walk away. He kept going. He sent another shipment the following year, lost money again, sent another. His family's fortune collapsed in a bad real estate deal. He went to debtor's prison in 1812, got out, sent more ice, went back to prison, got out again, kept going. And slowly, through years of failure and iteration and obsessive note-taking in his personal journals, he figured it out. He figured out that sawdust packed tightly around and between the ice blocks was the best insulating material, better than straw, better than hay, better than anything else he had tried. He figured out that the blocks needed to be cut in uniform sizes and stacked like masonry, fitting snugly together to minimize the surface area exposed to warm air. He figured out that he needed to build ice houses at his destination ports, those double-walled, heavily insulated structures that could hold the ice until it was sold. And he built them himself, in Havana, in Charleston, in New Orleans. And then he figured out something that might be the most brilliant insight of his entire career. He gave ice away for free, to bartenders, to cafe owners, to anyone who served food and drinks to the public. He gave it away, let them discover what a cold drink tasted like, let their customers discover it, let the craving take hold, and then he started charging. As Tudor himself wrote in his journal, with a sharp clarity that any modern marketer would recognize, a man who has drunk his drinks cold at the same expense for 1 week can never be presented with them warm again. He had understood something profound about human appetite. You do not create a craving by explaining it. You create it by giving people a taste. By the 1830s, the business had become genuinely extraordinary. Tudor's Ice Company was operating across the American South and the Caribbean. And then came India. That 1833 voyage to Calcutta, the one I described at the beginning, was not just a commercial triumph. It was a statement. It proved that ice could be shipped anywhere on Earth, as long as you built the right infrastructure to handle it at the destination. Over the following decade, Tudor's ice travelled as far as Singapore, Hong Kong, Rio de Janeiro, Rangoon, Bombay and Madras. In 1847 alone, 353 ice-packed vessels left Boston Harbour. That same year, Boston exported almost 75,000 tons of ice. At the height of the trade, and this statistic genuinely stopped me when I first read it, American ships were carrying more tonnage of ice than any other commodity except for cotton. More than grain, more than timber, more than almost anything else the young nation produced. The word salary comes from salt, as we talked about earlier in our story. But if the global economy of the mid-1800s had needed a single word to capture its most surprising commodity, it might have borrowed something from the Latin word for frozen water, Now, I want to be honest with you about something because I think the honest version of this story is actually more interesting than the triumphant version. Frederick Tudor was a brilliant man and a driven one, and the industry he created genuinely changed the world. But the ice that he harvested and shipped was not, from the perspective of the average American family in 1830, something they could access at all. The ice trade in its early decades was a luxury business. It served wealthy households, hotels, breweries, and meat-packing operations in cities. The ordinary farm family in Ohio or Pennsylvania or the Carolinas did not receive ice deliverers. They could not afford ice houses of their own, and the kind of cold storage that Tudor was building for wealthy merchants in Calcutta was simply not available to them. What they had instead was something much older, something that required no ships, no commerce, no money, just earth, labour, and the physics of the ground beneath their feet. They had the root cellar. The root cellar is one of those inventions so simple, so elegant, so completely in harmony with the natural world, that it feels almost unfair to call it an invention at all. It is more of an observation, a realization. The ground, below a certain depth, maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round, not cold in the way a refrigerator is cold, not below freezing, but cool, consistently cool. In most of the temperate regions of North America and Europe, if you dig down 4 to 6 feet below the surface, the temperature stabilizes at somewhere between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether it is July or January outside. The earth itself becomes your insulation, holding a steady pocket of cool air against the fluctuations of the seasons above. Do you have any idea how useful that is, if you're trying to keep food alive without any technology at all? Potatoes stored in a properly built root cellar could last 5 to 8 months. Carrots, turnips, beets, parsnips, all through winter, all the way to the spring planting. Apples in barrels could be edible as late as April. Cabbages, packed carefully with their roots still attached, could last for months. Hard cheeses lasted 6 months or more. Even butter, packed in crocks and sealed, kept reasonably well. And all of it maintained by nothing more sophisticated than a hole in the ground with a well-fitted door. Almost every farmstead in colonial New England had one. By the early 1800s, they had spread across the country as settlement moved west. When pioneers dug into a hillside to build their first rough shelter on the frontier, they were often creating something that functioned as a root cellar by default, the earth itself providing the cool, stable environment that would keep their family fed through the first difficult winter. Think about what went into a well-stocked root cellar in October. The carrots came down first, pulled from the garden and packed in damp sand in wooden crates, the sand maintaining the moisture level that kept them from shriveling. Then the potatoes, sorted by hand, every damaged one removed because a single rotten potato in a barrel could, within a week, ruin everything around it. Then the turnips and parsnips stored separately. Then the winter squash, lined up on wooden shelves. Then the apples, but not near the other vegetables because apples release a gas that accelerates the ripening of everything around them. A fact that 19th century farmers understood empirically even without knowing the chemistry. Then the crocks of pickled vegetables, the jars of preserved fruit, the butter sealed in brine, the blocks of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and in the coolest corner, if the family had it, the salt pork and cured meats that would supplement the smoked hams hanging in the smokehouse. A woman managing this root cellar was doing something extraordinarily complex, juggling the different storage requirements of dozens of different foods, monitoring humidity, watching for the first signs of spoilage, making constant decisions about what to use now and what to save for February. It was, in every real sense, the work of a food scientist, performed by someone who had never heard that term and had learned everything she knew from her mother and her mother before her. Here is something that I find quietly remarkable about the relationship between root cellars and ice houses, because these two technologies represent two completely different approaches to the same problem. The root cellar was democratized cold. It was available to anyone who had the physical ability to dig and the knowledge to build correctly. It required no money, no commerce, no industry. It was cold storage grown from the earth itself, free and renewable and available everywhere in the temperate world. The ice house was cold for the privileged. Tudor's ice in the early decades flowed to the wealthy. But as the industry expanded through the 1840s and 50s, something interesting began to happen. Ice prices fell as competition increased. By 1860, when Tudor died, 2/3 of New York City and Boston households were receiving regular ice deliveries. The icebox, that insulated wooden cabinet with a compartment for a block of ice, had become a fixture in urban middle-class kitchens. A whole new category of food became possible. Truly fresh milk that lasted more than a day, fresh meat in summer, butter that did not go rancid in July, and the ice trade, by creating demand for cold food storage, directly accelerated the development of the technology that eventually made both the root cellar and the ice house obsolete. Because once people had tasted what truly cold food preservation felt like, once they had experienced the possibility of fresh butter in August and iced drinks on a sweltering afternoon, they wanted it reliably, affordably, without depending on the winter weather of a Massachusetts pond. That hunger, that newly created appetite for the cold, was what drove inventors and engineers toward mechanical refrigeration. The ice trade did not just feed people, it taught them what cold food could taste like, and made them never want to go back. Frederick Tudor died in 1864, worth roughly $200 million in today's money. He had gone from debtor's prison to one of the wealthiest men in New England, all on the back of a substance that had seemed, to everyone around him, completely worthless. But here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about Tudor's story, and it is not really about business at all. It is about imagination. In a world where cold was expensive, hard to get, and available only briefly in winter, he looked at a frozen pond and saw the future of food. He saw the possibility that every person on Earth deserved access to something cold. He was wrong about a lot of the details and right about the fundamental direction. And the direction he pointed toward cold, toward freshness, toward food that did not have to be smoked or salted or buried in the ground to survive a week, was the direction the whole world was about to move. But moving in that direction took more than one man with a ship full of ice. It required a different kind of revolution entirely, one that began not on a dock in Boston, but in the kitchen of a French chef who was trying to solve a problem for an army. A chef who discovered something so simple and so powerful that it would eventually change every kitchen on Earth. And his discovery, and the strange winding path it travelled from the army of Napoleon Bonaparte to the shelves of your grandmother's pantry, is the next stop on our journey tonight. Somewhere in Paris in the year 1804, a 60-year-old confectioner was standing over a pot of boiling water, dropping glass bottles into it one at a time. The bottles were sealed with cork, reinforced with wax, and wrapped tightly in cloth to prevent shattering. Inside some of them was beef broth, in others preserved vegetables, in others still cooked meat, fruit compotes, and soups. He had been doing this, experimenting, refining, failing, trying again, for nearly a decade. His neighbours probably thought he was eccentric. His wife had watched him convert their home into something between a kitchen and a laboratory. His name was Nicholas Appert, and he had absolutely no idea why what he was doing worked. That is one of my favourite details in all of food history, because it speaks to something profound about the nature of human discovery. Appert did not understand microbiology. Louis Pasteur would not prove the connection between microorganisms and spoilage for another 50 years. Appert had no microscope, no scientific training, no formal education beyond what he had absorbed working as a chef and confectioner. He believed, incorrectly, that it was air that caused food to rot, so his strategy was simply to eliminate air from his sealed bottles as completely as possible. His theory was wrong, his process worked perfectly, and in working, it changed the world. Let me tell you the full story of how this happened, because it begins not in a kitchen but in a military campaign, and it involves one of the most famous figures in European history looking at his starving army and deciding that the problem needed to be solved. In 1795, the French revolutionary government, fighting wars on multiple fronts, stretching supply lines across Europe, offered a prize, 12,000 francs, roughly the equivalent of $300,000 in today's money. The prize would go to anyone who could develop a reliable method of preserving food for long-term military use. The armies of France were eating essentially what armies had eaten for centuries: salted meat, hardtack biscuit, a dense, nearly indestructible bread made from flour and water that could survive for months in a pack, but tasted roughly like eating a wooden shingle, and dried legumes. It was calorie-dense enough to keep men alive and mobile. It was not enough to keep them healthy, and it was definitely not enough to win wars that required men to be vigorous, clear-headed, and physically capable over months of sustained campaigning. Napoleon Bonaparte, who reportedly said, and I have always loved this quote whether or not it is perfectly accurate, that an army marches on its stomach, understood this with clarity. Hungry soldiers were not just miserable soldiers, they were slow soldiers, sick soldiers, deserting soldiers. The logistics of feeding an army of hundreds of thousands across occupied Europe was in many ways as militarily significant as the question of how many cannons you had, and so the prize was offered, and Nicolas Appert spent 14 years trying to win it. Think about that commitment for a moment. 14 years. Appert started experimenting in 1795, the same year the prize was announced. He was already in his mid-40s, a successful confectioner in Paris with a wife and children and a comfortable, if not extravagant, life. He did not need to risk it all chasing a government prize. But something about the problem had gotten under his skin. He'd spent his whole career working with food, learning how to preserve fruit in sugar, how to bottle champagne without losing the carbonation, how to work with the delicate chemistry of heat and fermentation gone wrong. He had an intuition that a better answer existed. His early experiments used champagne bottles. The heavy, thick glass that he knew from his work as a champagne bottler could withstand pressure without breaking. He filled them with food, sealed them, and submerged them in boiling water. Then he waited. Weeks. Months. Some of the bottles failed. The seal broke. The contents spoiled. He adjusted his technique. He boiled them longer. He improved the corking method. He wrapped the bottles more carefully. He recorded everything with meticulous attention. In 1804, he opened the world's first food bottling factory in the town of Massy, south of Paris. It was a small operation, a few workers, large copper boiling vessels, rows of glass bottles, but it was producing preserved food on a commercial scale, which had never been done before in human history. And then in 1807, something happened that changed everything. The French Navy tested his preserved foods on long sea voyages. The bottles came back months later, opened, examined. The contents were, and this genuinely shocked the naval officers who tasted them, still good, not just edible, good. A broth that had been sealed and boiled in Paris was still rich and savoury after months at sea. Vegetables that had been packed in glass were still tender and flavourful. This was, by every prior understanding of how food worked, impossible. In 1809, Nicolas Appert won the prize, 12,000 francs awarded by the French government, on the condition that he publish his methods so that others could benefit from them. Here is where I want to share a thought, because I find this condition remarkable. The French government, in awarding Appert his prize, required that his discovery become public knowledge. They explicitly did not allow him to keep it as a trade secret. They understood, with a clarity that we might find surprising from a government of that era, that a food preservation method this important belonged to everyone. It should not be locked behind a single company's walls. It should be given to the world. In 1810, Appert published his book. The title translates roughly as The Art of Preserving All Kinds of Animal and Vegetable Substances for Several Years. It was the first book in history devoted entirely to the science of food preservation. Within a year, it had been translated into English and was circulating in England and America. Within a decade, people across the world were following his instructions, sealing food in glass bottles and boiling them in water. Appert, for his part, used his prize money to expand his factory. He kept working. He kept improving. He lived to be 91 years old, which might say something about the quality of the food he was eating, and he died in 1841 having personally watched his invention transform the way the entire world thought about feeding itself. He died poor, actually. He was not a good businessman by most accounts, but his invention was already everywhere. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting from the perspective of how ordinary people in the 1800s were eating. Because the bottled food that Appert invented was, at first, primarily a military and naval technology. It was expensive. The glass bottles broke. The process was labor-intensive, 5 to 6 hours of boiling for a single batch, by early accounts. And the quantities required for industrial production exceeded what any single factory could manage. What changed everything, what brought Appert's invention off the warships and into the farmhouse kitchen, was a combination of two separate innovations that arrived decades apart. The first was the tin can. Within a year of Appert's publication, a British merchant named Peter Durand realized that the glass bottle was the weak point in the whole system. Glass was heavy. It broke in transit. It was expensive to manufacture. What if you replaced it with metal? In 1810, Durand patented the use of tin plate, iron coated with a thin layer of tin to prevent rust, as a container for preserved food. The tin can was born. By 1812, a British factory was producing canned food for the Royal Navy. By 1813, the first canned meats were being sold to military buyers. The process was still slow. Early tin cans had to be hand-soldered, and each one could take a skilled worker nearly an hour to complete. A single early tin can weigh roughly 7 pounds. You needed a hammer and chisel to open it. There was actually an instruction printed on some early cans that read, rather optimistically, "Cut round the top near the outer edge with the chisel and hammer." Not exactly designed for the home cook, but the technology improved. It always does. By the 1840s and 1850s, canned food was reaching American consumers in earnest. Canned oysters, canned salmon, canned tomatoes, canned corn. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, the Union Army was consuming canned food in quantities that would have seemed unimaginable to Appert's generation. The war created an enormous demand for preserved, portable, nutritious food, and the canning industry expanded to meet it with a speed that transformed the technology from novelty to necessity. But the canning revolution in American homes, the one that changed not just military supply chains but the daily lives of ordinary farm families, really accelerated because of a single invention by a single man. And this man, in a genuinely remarkable piece of historical irony, died penniless. His name was John Landis Mason. He was a tinsmith from New York City, 26 years old, and in 1858 he patented something so elegant, so simple, so perfectly suited to the needs of the American home kitchen that it has never really been improved upon in the century and a half since. He invented a glass jar with a threaded neck and a metal screw-top lid. That is it. That is the whole invention. A jar you could fill with food, screw the lid on, boil it in water to create a seal, and then store on a shelf until you needed it. The seal was reliable, the jar was reusable, the lid was affordable, and the process was simple enough that any woman in any farmhouse in America could learn it in an afternoon. The mason jar, and I want you to think about this the next time you see one on a shelf somewhere, because they're still everywhere, was the technology that made home canning democratically accessible, not just for wealthy households with servants and equipment, for everyone. Do you have any mason jars in your home right now? I genuinely wonder, because they have experienced an almost cyclical relationship with American culture, necessary in the 19th century, nostalgic in the 20th, fashionable again in the 21st. But their original purpose was purely about survival, about a woman in rural Indiana in 1870 looking at the summer's abundance of tomatoes and peaches and corn and thinking, how do I make this last until February? The mason jar was her answer, and the process she used to fill it was a direct descendant of what Nicolas Appert had discovered in that boiling pot in Paris, decades before. Here is what the canning season actually looked like in a farmhouse in the 1870s or 80s, because I think it deserves to be described rather than just mentioned. It began in late spring, usually with the strawberries, then the cherries, then the first summer vegetables, green beans, early corn, the first ripe tomatoes. A woman and her daughters would spend entire days in a kitchen that was already hot from the summer heat, made hotter still by the enormous pots of boiling water on the stove. The vegetables were washed, trimmed, packed into the glass jars. Salt was added to the savoury ones, sugar to the fruits. The filled jars were lowered into the boiling water bath and processed for the prescribed time, then lifted out hot and steaming and set to cool on the kitchen table in rows, and as they cooled, you could hear them one by one emit that distinctive pop, the sound of the lid being pulled down by the forming vacuum seal. That pop was the sound of success, the sound of food that was going to make it to February. The first dedicated home canning cookbook was not published until 1887, a book by Sarah Tyson Rohrer, a food writer who recognized that the combination of mason jars and Appert's technique had created an entirely new domestic practice that needed its own literature. Some of her recipes, preserved citrus, strawberry jam, tomato relish, would not look out of place in any modern farmer's market. Others, like peaches stuffed with horseradish and sewn shut with thread, were rather more emphatically of their time. There is something I find genuinely moving about the canning tradition, and I want to say it plainly before we move on, because I think it deserves acknowledgement. The women who canned were doing something more than preserving food. They were practicing a kind of faith, a belief that the work you do today, the hot, repetitive, physically exhausting work of August and September, would protect the people you love in January and February. That the pop of a sealed jar was not just a sound but a small promise kept, a small victory over the entropy that was always trying to take everything apart. Appert spent 14 years and a lifetime of labour on a discovery he could not fully explain, won a prize for work that made him famous but not wealthy, watched his factory destroyed by war, rebuilt it, lost it again. And yet what he figured out, standing over a pot of boiling water in Paris, became one of the most consequential inventions in the history of food. The thing that allowed people in the 1800s to eat tomatoes in December, to taste summer in the middle of winter, to carry food across oceans and continents without it rotting. Not bad for a confectioner who thought he was just keeping air out of a bottle. By the latter half of the 1800s, then, the American farmhouse had salt and smoke and root cellars and ice and canning jars. All of these technologies layered on top of each other, creating a surprisingly complex system of food security that bore almost no resemblance to anything a person today would recognize. But here is something that has not yet come up in our story, and it is something that I think surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. In all of this remarkable ingenuity around preserving, storing, and keeping food, there was also a darker side, a side where the food itself was not what it claimed to be, where the milk in your pitcher had been watered down, the bread in your kitchen had been extended with things that had no business being in bread, and the substances in your pantry had been doctored, adulterated, and sometimes outright poisoned by the people who sold them to you. The food fraud of the 1800s was not a minor problem. It was not an edge case. It was, in the words of historians who have studied it, practically an epidemic. And the story of how ordinary people discovered what was really in their food and what it cost some of them to find out is one of the most alarming, most important, and least told chapters in the whole history of eating. That chapter opens right now. What if I told you that in 1851, a British doctor walked into the shops of London with a simple mission? He would buy ordinary food, the bread people ate every morning, the milk mothers poured for their children, the tea that went into every kettle in every household in the city, and then he would put it under a microscope. His name was Arthur Hill Hassall. He was a physician and chemist, small in build, meticulous in habit, and apparently possessed of the particular kind of stubbornness that allows a person to do something that everyone around them considers either pointless or dangerous. He had already used his microscope to expose the filth in London's water supply. Now he was going to turn it on the food. He worked for the medical journal The Lancet, and over the next 4 years, from 1851 to 1854, he and his colleagues purchased and analysed thousands of samples of common food sold in ordinary London shops, not luxury items, not exotic imports, the everyday food of working people, the bread, the milk, the coffee, the tea, the beer, the butter, the spices. What he found, and what he published, with the names and addresses of the traders from whom each sample was purchased, which was genuinely bold in a way that took real courage, was a picture of systematic, pervasive, industrial-scale fraud that shocked even people who already suspected the food was not quite right. Almost everything was adulterated. Almost everything. Let me give you the specifics, because the specifics are what make this story real. The bread that formed the basic caloric foundation of life for the British working class, and we're talking about an era when bread might constitute the majority of what a poor family ate in a day, was routinely extended with alum. Alum is a compound of aluminum and sulfate, used industrially as a water clarifier. In bread, it served two purposes that bakers found extremely convenient. It made the bread look whiter and more appealing, and it allowed them to use lower quality, cheaper flour while still producing a loaf that looked fine. By 1872, Hassall demonstrated that half of the bread he examined contained significant quantities of alum. The problem was not just fraud. Alum, while not directly poisonous in small doses, interferes with the absorption of other nutrients. In an era of widespread malnutrition, when poor children depended on bread as their primary food source, the alum in their daily loaves was making it harder for their bodies to absorb what little nutrition was there. Historians have since connected widespread alum adulteration to the epidemic of rickets that disfigured so many working-class children in Victorian cities. The bowed legs, the soft bones, the stunted growth. These were not simply the inevitable result of poverty. They were, in part, the result of being systematically lied to about what was in the food. Now, the milk. I want you to pause for a moment and think about how central milk was to the diet of a child in the 1800s. In an era before infant formula, before reliable alternatives, before anyone fully understood infant nutrition, milk was considered the most essential food for the young and the sick. Mothers gave it to babies. It was the food that was supposed to build healthy bodies. In New York City in the 1840s, a practice had taken hold among certain dairy farmers that would make your blood run cold if you heard it described. The farmers discovered that they could dramatically increase their production by feeding their cows on something called swill, the fermented grain waste produced by nearby distilleries. The cows would eat it readily enough. The problem was that the milk it produced was thin, bluish in colour, and virtually devoid of nutritional value. So the farmers mixed it with additives, starch to thicken it, chalk to whiten it, plaster of Paris for colour and body, diluted with water to stretch the volume even further. This milk, which looked like milk, smelled roughly like milk, and was sold as milk, was then delivered to city households in ordinary glass bottles. Thousands of families bought it every day. Babies drank it. Sick people were given it to help them recover, and children died. The death rate among infants in New York City neighborhoods served by these swill dairies was catastrophically high. Investigators who examined the situation in the early 1850s made the connection explicit. The milk was, in the words of the period, a manufactured product bearing no resemblance to the article it claimed to be. The Lancet, reporting on comparable situations in London around the same time, described London milk as a wishy-washy triumph of art over nature, milk from the pump and chalk pit without ever having been possessed of a cow. That is one of the most savage sentences ever written about food, and it was accurate. So what else was being doctored? Let me tell you about the coffee, because this one is a little darkly funny, or at least it would be funny if the consequences were not so serious. Coffee was expensive in the 1800s. It was an imported luxury that trickled down to the working classes in affordable but heavily adulterated form. The most common adulterant was chicory, the ground root of a common plant that, brewed with hot water, produces something that looks vaguely like coffee and tastes vaguely like coffee if you have never actually tasted real coffee. Mixed in with ground roasted coffee at a ratio of perhaps 50-50, it was nearly undetectable to the average consumer. Chicory, at least, is harmless. Many of the other adulterants were not. Green tea, fashionable, expensive, imported from China, was being counterfeited wholesale. Investigations in the 1850s revealed an operation where used tea leaves were collected from hotels and restaurants, dried and re-dried, coloured with metallic compounds to restore their green appearance, and then sold as fresh Chinese tea. The colouring agents included copper sulfate and lead. Think about that. The people buying what they believed was expensive premium green tea were drinking boiled copper and lead. The pepper in your pepper shaker might contain ground floor sweepings, or dried berries of plants that were not pepper at all. The vinegar might be diluted with water and acidified with sulfuric acid. The candy given to children was frequently coloured with red lead and other heavy metal compounds chosen purely because they produced vivid colours at low cost and were difficult to detect without laboratory equipment. And here is where I want to share a genuine observation, because I think it illuminates something about the 1800s that tends to get lost when we talk about this era. We often assume that the past was more honest in its relationship to food, that people who grew their own food or bought from local producers they knew personally were somehow protected from the kind of manipulation and fraud that we associate with modern industrialized food systems. And for those who did grow their own food, on their own land, or who had access to producers they personally trusted, that assumption is largely correct. But here is the reality that Assaul's investigation laid bare. The moment food entered the commercial market, the moment it was processed, packaged, or sold through any kind of intermediary, it was vulnerable to fraud. And in rapidly growing 19th century cities, where most people had no land, no animals, no way to produce their own food, and no means of testing what they bought, that vulnerability was exploited with a thoroughness that would be unimaginable today. The guiding legal principle of the era, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, essentially placed the entire burden of ensuring food safety on the consumer, and the consumer had no tools, no information, no laboratory, and no legal recourse. The Bradford incident of 1858 is, in many ways, the moment when the general slow horror of food adulteration collapsed into a single event so specific and so terrible that no government could continue looking the other way. A confectioner in Bradford, England, was making hard candy. Peppermint humbugs, as they were called. Because sugar was expensive, he routinely extended his mixture with a filler substance, commonly a chalk or gypsum compound called daff in the local trade. It was standard practice. Everyone did it. On this particular occasion, his supplier made an error. Instead of gypsum powder, the supplier sent arsenic trioxide, white arsenic, visually indistinguishable from the filler the confectioner had been ordering for years. The confectioner did not know. He mixed it into his candy as usual. He sold it through a market stall. 20 people died. 200 more became seriously ill, with symptoms that physicians recognized as severe arsenic poisoning. The victims range from children who had bought a few pennies worth of sweets to adults who had eaten them as casual purchases. 3 men were arrested: the wholesale chemist who sold the arsenic, his assistant who had dispensed it, and the confectioner who had used it. All 3 were ultimately acquitted on the grounds that no one had intentionally committed fraud. The arsenic had been sold accidentally. The confectioner had not known what he was mixing into his candy, which was true, and which was, in its own way, the most damning indictment of the system possible, because the entire chain of events, from the routine adulteration of candy with cheap fillers to the careless handling of toxic industrial chemicals alongside food ingredients, to the complete absence of any regulatory check at any stage, was not an accident. It was a system that had been allowed to develop over decades because the law said, "Let the buyer beware." The public outrage following Bradford was enormous, and in 1860, Britain passed its first significant food adulteration legislation. Now, I need to be honest with you about how limited that first law actually was, because I think honesty matters more here than a clean narrative arc. The 1860 Act was, in the words of historians who have studied it, nearly useless. It applied fines of £5, the equivalent of modest pocket money for a prosperous tradesman, for selling knowingly adulterated food. It required proof of deliberate fraud, which was almost impossible to establish. It made no provision for government testing. It did not require local authorities to appoint food inspectors. In the entire United Kingdom and Ireland, only 7 public analysts were appointed in the 12 years following the Act. The real change came slowly, gradually, through a combination of continued investigative reporting, advancing chemistry, building public pressure, and, eventually, the recognition by governments on both sides of the Atlantic that an unregulated food supply was a public health crisis that no amount of individual vigilance could solve. In America, the same reckoning was coming, driven by similar forces. Harvey Wiley, a chemist working for the United States Department of Agriculture, spent decades documenting American food fraud, from formaldehyde used as a preservative in milk, to lead-based coloring in candy, to to the wildly misleading labels on patent medicines and processed foods, and campaigning for federal regulation. His work, along with the horrifying revelations in Upton Sinclair's novel about the Chicago meatpacking industry, finally produced the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. The Food and Drug Administration, the agency that today approves every food additive and monitors the safety of everything you buy at a supermarket, was born in a direct line from the revelations that Hassall had made sitting at his microscope in London in the early 1850s. Think about what it took to get there, though. Decades of investigation, hundreds of published reports, a generation of sick children, 20 deaths from arsenic candy in Bradford, thousands of pages of parliamentary testimony. And even then, the first law was nearly useless. And still, the changes came. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely. But the direction was always toward transparency, toward accountability, toward the idea that a person buying food should be able to trust what they are buying, that the effort of working a long day and spending your wages on bread for your family should not require a chemistry degree to ensure the bread would not harm you. That principle, that food safety is a public responsibility, not just a personal one, was one of the great moral achievements of the 19th century. Hard won, bitterly contested, paid for in suffering, but won. When you look at a food label today, when you read an ingredients list, when you trust that the milk you pour for your child is what it says it is, you are the beneficiary of that achievement, of Hassall's microscope, of the 20 people who died in Bradford, of the scientists and journalists and physicians who spent decades insisting that the caveat emptor of the marketplace was not sufficient protection for the bodies of ordinary people. I find that worth knowing. I find it worth holding for a moment this evening before we move on, because while all of this was happening, while the cities of Britain and America were struggling with adulterated food and the slow machinery of reform, something else was unfolding that would change the entire geography of eating in ways that even the most optimistic reformers could not fully predict. Up until the middle of the 1800s, what you ate was determined almost entirely by where you lived. A family in coastal New England ate oysters and cod. A family in the Ohio Valley ate corn and pork. A family in the Deep South ate rice and sweet potatoes. Not because they chose those foods from a range of options, but because those were the foods their land and their climate and their season produced. The railroad was about to change all of that, and with it, a transformation so swift and so complete that within a single generation, the American diet would look almost unrecognizable compared to what it had been. The story of how food started to travel, and what was gained, and what was quietly lost when it did, is coming up right now. Consider the oyster for a moment. In 1850, if you were a working-class family living in New York City, an oyster was not a luxury. It was lunch. Street vendors sold them from barrels on every corner. You could buy a dozen for a penny. They were everywhere. Fried, stewed, roasted in their shells, packed into pies, slipped raw from the half-shell on the street. New York Harbor was so extraordinarily abundant with oysters that the city had developed an entire culture around them. The oyster bed stretched for miles beneath the water, and the oysters were fat, clean, and in endless supply. Now consider this. If you were a family living in Cincinnati at that same moment, barely 700 miles away, a fresh New York oyster was essentially an impossibility. By the time one could have travelled that distance by wagon or canal boat, it would have been inedible for days. The gap between what existed in abundance at the coast and what was available inland was, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible. That is the world before the railroad truly changed food, a world of profound, rigid geographic constraint. What you ate was almost entirely determined by where you stood on the map. The railroad had been building across America since the 1830s, but its transformation of the food system was not immediate. It was gradual, then suddenly overwhelming. By 1860, the eastern half of the United States was linked by a web of railroad lines dense enough that over 80% of farms in the Corn Belt, the agricultural heartland stretching from Ohio to Iowa, were within 5 miles of a railway. And then, in 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was completed, linking the Pacific coast to the existing eastern network. The country shrank overnight, not physically, of course, but in terms of the time it took to move things, people, goods, food, across vast distances, the change was staggering. Before the railroad, transporting freight from Pittsburgh to New York City took roughly 3 weeks. After, it took days. The cost fell to a small fraction of what it had been, and where cost and time fell, access expanded. But here is the thing that I think gets underappreciated about the railroad and food. The physical track was only part of the story. Laying iron rails across a continent was the easier part in a way. The harder part was figuring out what to do with perishable food, meat, produce, dairy, once you had a vehicle capable of moving it quickly. Because a faster trip does not help you if the food rots halfway through. That problem, and the way it was solved, is one of the great logistical stories of the 19th century. Think about what happened when a farmer in Illinois in 1860 wanted to sell beef in Boston. His only option, essentially, was to load live cattle onto a rail car and send them east. The animals lost 8 to 15% of their body weight during the journey from stress, dehydration, and the physical exertion of keeping their footing on a moving train. Many were injured, some died, and when they arrived in Boston, they still had to be slaughtered locally, which meant that Boston needed its own slaughterhouses, its own labour, its own infrastructure. The whole process was expensive, wasteful, and inefficient in ways that could only be solved if someone figured out how to ship the meat instead of the animal. Gustavus Swift was born in 1839 on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and he had been thinking about meat since he was a teenager working in his brother's butcher shop. By the time he moved to Chicago in the 1870s, he had already developed a clear, almost mathematical understanding of the economics of the beef trade. He knew exactly how much of a cow's body weight was inedible. He knew the shrinkage losses of live transport. He knew the cost of maintaining slaughterhouses in every city. And he could see, with the clarity of a man who'd spent his entire life handling meat, that the whole system was built backwards. Why ship the living animal with all its weight and fragility and mortality when you could slaughter the animal in Chicago, where the infrastructure already existed, where the labour was concentrated, where the scale economies were extraordinary, and ship only the dressed carcass? 60% of the live weight neatly packaged ready for the butcher's counter at the destination. The answer, of course, was the cold. You could not ship dressed beef in summer without refrigeration. The meat would spoil before it reached New York, let alone Boston. In 1878, Swift hired an engineer named Andrew Chase to design a solution. What Chase and Swift came up with was elegant. The ice was positioned in a compartment at the top of the car rather than directly against the meat. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would flow naturally downward from the ice compartment through the car, cooling the meat packed at the bottom without touching it directly. The car was heavily insulated. The meat was loaded tightly to keep the centre of gravity low and prevent shifting on the tracks. It worked. The first test shipments of chilled beef left Chicago in early 1878 and arrived in New York City and Boston in saleable condition, without spoilage. Swift had done the near impossible. He had shipped fresh meat across 1,000 miles of American continent in the middle of winter and delivered it to market in better condition than the live cattle that had been making the same journey for decades. And then the railroads refused to carry his cars. I genuinely love this detail because it reveals something true about how innovation actually works and how entrenched interests fight it. The major American railroads had enormous investments in the infrastructure of the live cattle trade. They owned the stock cars. They owned the animal pens at railheads. They collected substantial revenue from the live transport of millions of cattle every year. A shift to refrigerated dressed beef would make all of that worthless. So they simply declined to haul Swift's refrigerator cars. Swift's response? He found a railroad that had nothing to lose. The Grand Trunk Railway, a Canadian line that carried almost no livestock traffic, agreed to haul his cars through Michigan and eastward through Canada. Within a year, Swift had a fleet of nearly 200 refrigerator cars and was delivering an average of 3,000 carcasses per week to Boston alone. By 1880, fresh beef from Chicago was reaching New York and Boston at retail prices 75 cents to $1 per 100 pounds cheaper than the local competition. By 1885, competing firms, Armour, Morris, Hammond, had all followed Swift's lead. The live cattle trade to eastern cities was finished. Now, stop and think about what this meant for an ordinary family in Boston or Philadelphia in 1882. For the first time in their lives, they had access to reliably fresh beef, not salted, not smoked, not preserved, throughout the entire year, including the hottest weeks of summer. And it was cheaper than what they'd been buying before. That single shift, which unfolded over roughly a decade, changed what Americans ate for dinner in ways that rippled outward in every direction. Fresh meat became a daily expectation rather than a seasonal or occasional pleasure. The neighborhood butcher shop, stocked from Chicago rather than from the local slaughterhouse, became a fixture of working-class neighborhoods. The language of cooking changed. The assumption of what a normal family dinner contained changed. And the railroad was not just moving meat. By the 1870s and 80s, the produce trade was following a similar trajectory. A Georgia peach grower named Samuel Rumpf, frustrated that the lack of cold transport limited his market to a few counties around his farm, invented a specialized refrigerator car for fruit in 1875. His innovation created, in effect, the commercial peach industry of Georgia, and more broadly, established the principle that soft, highly perishable fruit could travel hundreds of miles if the cold was managed carefully enough. By the 1880s, California oranges were appearing in Midwestern cities. Florida strawberries were reaching New York in early spring, weeks before local fruit was ripe. Grapes from California vineyards were arriving in Chicago still fresh, and farmers across the country began making planting decisions not just based on what they could sell locally, but on what would travel well and command a premium in distant urban markets. Can you imagine what it felt like to eat a fresh orange in Ohio in January in 1885 for the first time in your life? I genuinely try to picture that moment. The colour of it against the grey of a winter kitchen, the smell when you broke the skin, the sweetness, which you had only tasted before in perhaps dried or preserved form, flooding your mouth with something that tasted unmistakably like a place you had never been and a season you were not currently in. That experience of eating something out of season, out of place, was entirely new in human history, and the railroad made it ordinary within a single generation. There is a shadow side to this story that I think deserves honest acknowledgement, because I believe that the full picture is almost always more interesting than the triumphant version. The same railroad network that brought fresh oranges to Ohio also began dismantling the extraordinary regional diversity of American food. Before the railroad, what people ate in different parts of the country was genuinely different, shaped by local soil and climate and tradition, and the specific plants and animals that thrived in each place. That diversity was not romantic. Much of it was the result of constraint and scarcity. But within that constraint had grown real culinary cultures. The cornbreads and slow-cooked greens of the South, the seafood stews of the New England coast, the hearty grain dishes of the Midwest, the chili and bean traditions of the Southwest. As the railroad network homogenized food supply, sending the same Midwestern beef, the same California produce, the same standardized flour to every market in the country, those regional distinctions began to blur. The butcher in Cleveland started carrying the same cuts as the butcher in Atlanta. The grocery in Portland, Maine started stocking the same staple goods as the grocery in Portland, Oregon. Some of what was lost in the homogenization was inconvenient and limiting. The forced monotony of eating only what the local season produced. But some of what was lost was genuinely irreplaceable. A way of eating that was rooted in specific land, specific seasons, specific knowledge, specific community. A relationship between people and the food their particular piece of the earth could produce. We're still in some ways trying to find our way back to that. The farmers' markets, the farm-to-table movements, the local food advocates. They're trying to recover something that the railroad, in its brilliant efficiency, helped erode. Whether that recovery is possible in the world the railroad made is a question we have not fully answered yet. But let me close this piece of the story with a thought that I find genuinely moving. For most of human history, for the farmers and their families who made up 90% of the American population at the beginning of the 1800s, food was the central organizing fact of existence. It determined your daily schedule, your seasonal calendar, your relationship to your land and your neighbors, your fears about the future and your gratitude for the present. The railroad began to change that. Quietly, gradually, then with astonishing speed, it shifted food from the center of daily life toward the periphery. You no longer had to know where your food came from. You no longer had to have grown it, or preserved it, or known the person who did. It arrived packaged and reliable from somewhere else, and your day was freed for other things. That freedom was real. For millions of people who had spent their lives in exhausting, uncertain relationship with the food they needed to survive, the reliability and abundance that the railroad eventually helped create was genuinely liberating. But something was also given away in that transaction, something about attention and knowledge and the particular kind of relationship with the physical world that comes from being personally responsible for your own sustenance. We live in that tension still, between the freedom of abundance and the hunger for rootedness, between the convenience of the global food system and the longing for something that feels connected to where we actually are. The railroad changed who could eat what and when and from where. But the story of how Americans and Europeans actually ate in the 1800s, the full picture of what sat on the table, who prepared it, and how it was understood, is not complete without looking at the enormous divide that existed between the richest and the poorest tables, between the 6-course dinners of the Victorian upper class and the thin soups of the urban labouring poor, and between both of those and something that almost no one talks about, the food of the people who, in that same era, had no choice in what they were given. Because the distance between rich table and poor table in the 1800s was not just a matter of budget. It was a reflection of the entire social order of the century, and the food that power gave to the powerless tells us more about that order than almost anything else. That story is next. Let me set 2 tables for you tonight. The first is in a townhouse in London or New York City, sometime in the 1870s. The dining room has been prepared since 3 in the afternoon. the white tablecloth starched and pressed, the silver polished, the crystal gleaming in the candlelight. 8 people are seated. The meal will take 2.5 hours. It will consist of 12 courses. There will be 2 soups, 1 clear consommé, 1 thick cream, served first, then fish, then a remove, which is the term for a large roasted joint carried in with ceremony, then entrees, then a pause, and then dessert in multiple rounds, followed by ice and bonbons, and finally, for the men, a withdrawal to another room for brandy and cigars. The hostess has spent 3 days planning this meal. The cook has been at work since early morning. 3 servants will carry the dishes from the kitchen and stand in attendance throughout. The guests will use, at various points during the evening, specialized forks designed for oysters, for fish, for salad, and for dessert, each shaped differently, each conveying in its specificity the same silent message. We are people who require these distinctions. Now let me set the second table. It is a tenement room in London's East End, or in Lower Manhattan, or in any one of 100 industrial cities growing explosively through the second half of the 19th century. The table is a plank of wood. There may not be chairs enough for everyone. The meal is bread, probably bought that morning from a street baker, possibly containing alum, almost certainly made from flour cut with cheaper substitutes. There may be dripping, the solidified fat scraped from a roasting pan, saved and used as a substitute for butter, which the family cannot afford. There may be weak tea, the same leaves used for the 3rd time. There may be nothing else. The distance between these 2 tables, measured not in miles but in everything else, is one of the defining realities of life in the 1800s, and it is a story that I do not think we have fully reckoned with, even now. Let me give you the specifics of the upper-class table first, because they are genuinely extraordinary. A formal Victorian dinner for guests was, by the standards of anything that came before or after it, an almost theatrical event. Historian Judith Flanders, writing about Victorian domestic life, describes the elaborate machinery of an upper-class dinner party in precise detail. The courses were structured according to a French system that had become the gold standard for fashionable dining across Europe and America by the middle of the century, known as service à la Russe, which meant that dishes were brought out one at a time in sequence rather than the older style of placing everything on the table at once. An affluent family dining alone, not entertaining, just having dinner, would sit down to 5 or 6 courses as a matter of routine. When entertaining, 12 or 13 courses was entirely normal. At the most extravagant occasions, the number could reach 20, with the table itself designed as a visual spectacle, decorated with elaborate centerpieces of fresh flowers and fruit. The food itself was extraordinary in its variety and richness. Turtle soup, the mock variety if the real green turtle was unavailable, but real if the host wished to impress. Sole in cream sauce, roast grouse or pheasant from the estate, saddle of mutton, glazed sweetbreads, charlotte russe for dessert, a cheese course, though, as one etiquette book of the period pointed out with delicious social anxiety, a lady or gentleman of real refinement would only pick at the cheese, since eating it heartily was considered working class. Think about that last detail for a moment. Bread and cheese was the basic meal of the poor, so in certain Victorian circles, enthusiastically eating cheese at dinner, food you actually liked and were actually hungry for, would mark you as someone who did not quite belong. The table itself was a minefield of social signals. By 1878, an anonymous etiquette guide was warning readers that fish must be eaten with a silver fish knife and fork, never an ordinary one. The fork, which had been introduced to European dining only a century or 2 before, had already been weaponized as a class marker. with the genteel convention being that you should push peas onto the back of the fork's tines, rather than scooping them up, as a hungry working person might do. The message embedded in these rules was not subtle. The way you eat tells everyone in the room who you are. Here is a question I find genuinely interesting, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. Who prepared all of this food? The woman of the upper-class household planned the menus, yes. She made the decisions about which courses to serve, which wines to pair, which cook to instruct. But she did not stand over a fire for 8 hours. She did not scrub the pots or carry the heavy iron vessels or stand in a kitchen that, in summer, reached temperatures that would make a modern kitchen feel cool by comparison. That labour was done by servants. In a wealthy Victorian household, the kitchen staff might include a head cook, an undercook, a kitchen maid, and a scullery maid. A hierarchy of labour in which each person's role was precisely defined, and the work was unrelenting. The scullery maid at the bottom of this hierarchy typically began work before 5 in the morning and finished well after the family had gone to bed. Her tasks included washing every pot, every dish, every utensil used in the preparation of 12 courses and their aftermath. She did this in cold water, on her knees, with no mechanical assistance of any kind. These women, and they were almost exclusively women, were part of the large class of domestic servants that constituted one of the largest categories of employment in both Victorian Britain and America in the 1800s. They ate separately from the family they served, in the kitchen or the servants' hall. Their own meals were considerably simpler than what appeared upstairs. They were, in the most literal sense, the invisible labour behind the performance of wealth. Now turn the camera to the other table, to the city. By 1850, roughly half of the British population lived in urban areas. By 1880, that number was approaching 70%. The same urban shift was underway in America, though on a slightly slower timeline. And what those urban working-class families ate, the millions of people who built the factories, dug the canals, laid the railroad tracks, worked the machines that drove the industrial economy, was, in many cases, barely sufficient to sustain them. A working-class family in an industrial British city in the 1860s or 70s might spend more than half of its total income on food. For that investment, they received a diet built almost entirely on bread, potatoes, occasional scraps of cheap meat, usually pork offcuts, fatty pieces that wealthier buyers had declined, weak tea, and whatever could be bought cheaply from street markets. Fresh vegetables were rare, fruit was a luxury. Milk, as we discussed, was often adulterated to the point of being nutritionally useless. The caloric reality was stark. A man doing heavy physical labour, 12 or 14 hours a day in a factory or on a building site, required somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories to sustain himself. Many working-class families were consuming significantly less. The result was not just hunger, but measurable physical consequences: stunted growth, high rates of infant mortality, susceptibility to respiratory disease, the bowed bones of rickets in children whose bread had been cut with alum and whose milk had been diluted to bluish water. And now I need to take us further, to a table that I think the history of food in the 1800s cannot be told honestly without, because it represents not just poverty and inequality, but something more fundamental, more deliberate, and more defining. The table of the enslaved. In the antebellum American South, this standard ration issued to enslaved people on plantations was documented by overseers, by abolitionists, by the enslaved people themselves in the interviews and narratives that were collected in the decades following emancipation. The standard, repeated in records from Georgia to Virginia to Louisiana, was almost universally the same: a peck of cornmeal per week, and between 3 and 5 pounds of salt pork or bacon. That is what the labour of an enslaved person was worth, in food, to the people who owned them. 1 peck of cornmeal, 3 to 5 pounds of salt pork, and not the good cuts of the pork either. Enslaved people received what the plantation households discarded: the feet, the ears, the jowls, the small intestines, the parts that had no market value, the parts that required the most labour and ingenuity to transform into something edible, and transform them they did. Here is what I think is one of the most extraordinary facts in all of American food history, and I want you to hold it carefully. The enslaved women and men who cooked on southern plantations, who prepared the elaborate meals that graced the tables of wealthy planter families, who developed the curing and smoking techniques that built the reputation of southern barbecue, who grew the vegetables in small garden plots after their working hours were finished, who combined the culinary knowledge of West Africa with the ingredients of the American South. Those people created, out of the most constrained circumstances imaginable, some of the most richly flavoured and deeply innovative cuisine in American history. Black-eyed peas, brought from Nigeria, became a staple because they were nourishing, easy to grow, and could be dried and stored. Collard greens, cooked long and slow in a pot with the fat back that formed the base of the ration, developed a depth of flavour that had nothing to do with the poverty of the ingredients and everything to do with the skill of the cook. The liquid left in the pot after the greens were cooked, pot liquor it was called, was so nourishing and so deeply flavoured that people fought over who would drink it. Cornbread, which could be eaten without utensils, which could survive a long day in a field, which could be made quickly in the ashes of a fire, became the foundation of a cuisine that would eventually reshape American cooking entirely. The sauces that enslaved cooks developed to transform tough, low-quality cuts of meat, vinegar and pepper, drawing on the spice traditions of West Africa, became, over time, the foundation of what we now call barbecue sauce, particularly in North Carolina and the Carolinas. The techniques for slow cooking over wood smoke, developed and refined by enslaved pitmasters over generations, became one of the defining signatures of American cuisine. I want to be honest about something here, because I think honesty about this history matters. The same people who made these culinary contributions were not credited for them. The cookbooks of the Victorian era in both America and Britain rarely acknowledged enslaved or servant cooks by name. The wealthy women whose menus they executed were celebrated. The wealthy hostesses whose dinner parties they laboured to produce were socially rewarded. The men who owned plantations were photographed and memorialised. The hands that did the actual work, the enslaved cook standing over a fire in brutal summer heat, the scullery maid scrubbing pots before dawn, the immigrant woman in a Lower East Side tenement stretching a handful of ingredients into a meal for 8 children. Those hands were largely invisible in the historical record, which makes recovering their stories, even partially, feel important. There is a detail from the records of the Burroughs Plantation in Franklin County, Virginia, the plantation where Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, that I have thought about many times since I first encountered it. The standard breakfast at that plantation for the enslaved was cornbread, sweet potatoes, and boiled corn. Historian records indicate that the children on the plantation were sometimes fed from a trough, a communal wooden vessel, in a manner that the white plantation owners apparently found unremarkable. Booker T. Washington, in his own memoir written decades later, recalled that his family slept on a dirt floor in a one-room cabin that had no windows. He wrote that the family had almost nothing, and yet, he also wrote about moments of unexpected sweetness, of the first time he tasted ginger cake, of the extraordinary warmth of the community that formed among the enslaved people, a warmth built in part around food, around the sharing of what little there was, around the skill of the cook who could transform the simplest ingredients into something that felt, even in the worst circumstances, like care. That is a kind of resilience that I do not have words adequate to describe, and it is part of the full story of how people ate in the 1800s, not just the 12-course dinners and the silver fish forks, also this. We've looked at the richest tables and the poorest ones. We've traced the journey from the farm to the root cellar to the smokehouse to the canning jar. We've watched the railroad arrive and change everything it touched, and we've met the people, brilliant, stubborn, sometimes criminal, sometimes quietly heroic, who shaped what ended up on the plate. But there is one more piece of the 1800s food story that I have been holding back, because it is, in some ways, the most unexpected chapter of all. It involves the general store, that small, seemingly humble building that stood at the center of almost every American town and village, and the extraordinary network of barter, credit, and community that made it function. Because the general store was not just a shop. It was, in many communities, the only thing standing between a family and true isolation. It was where vanilla extract arrived in a town that had never tasted it, where chocolate first crossed a counter into an Ohio farmhouse kitchen, where the everyday miracle of commerce made things possible that no farm or smokehouse or root cellar could produce alone. That story's coming right now. Somewhere in rural Ohio, in the autumn of 1845, a farm family is climbing into their wagon before sunrise. They have been planning this trip for 2 weeks. It is not a journey they make every day, or even every week. The nearest town is roughly 8 miles away, which on a muddy autumn road in a horse-drawn wagon is the better part of 2 hours each direction. They have made a list. The list has been sitting on the kitchen table, added to and revised, discussed and reconsidered, because this trip represents real money and real time and a real commitment of both. You do not hitch the wagon and drive 8 miles on a whim. What is on that list? Salt, certainly. Coffee, the raw green beans that will be roasted at home in a pan over the fire, then ground each morning with a hand mill that is one of the family's most prized possessions. Sugar, brown, coarse, arriving at the store in a large barrel from which the storekeeper will weigh out exactly what the family needs, wrapping it in paper, tying the parcel with string. Perhaps some tea, certainly flour, though they may bring some of their own wheat to be ground at a nearby mill, thread for sewing, lamp oil, something for the children's stockings at Christmas if the harvest has been good, and there, perhaps tucked at the bottom of the list in careful handwriting, something else, something that the farm could never produce on its own, something that arrived in that small Ohio town from the other side of the world, carried by ships and then wagons, travelling distances this family could barely imagine. Spices. Let me tell you what a general store actually was in the 1800s, because I think most of us have a romanticised version in our heads, mostly from old Western films, that does not quite capture the reality of what these places meant to the people who depended on them. A general store in rural America in the mid-19th century was not primarily a shopping experience. It was a lifeline. It was the point of connection between the isolated farmstead and the global economy. It was the place where the produce of the world's trade routes, spices from the East Indies, coffee from Brazil, tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, chocolate from Central America, arrived finally within reach of families who had never travelled more than 50 miles from where they were born. The physical structure of these stores, as described in accounts from the period, had a particular sensory quality that I find genuinely evocative. Walking in from the outside, you encountered the smell first, a dense, layered combination of cured meat hanging from the rafters, coffee beans in their barrel, pickles brining in crocks, tobacco, kerosene, leather, and the indefinable dusty sweetness of dried goods. These shelves ran floor to ceiling. Barrels of crackers, dried fruit, and pickled goods lined the walls. Cases of glass held smaller luxuries. Bolts of cloth stood upright in rows. Hardware, nails, hinges, wire, occupied one corner, medicines another. Everything arrived in bulk. There were very few prepackaged goods. The storekeeper weighed your sugar on a scale, scooped your coffee beans into a paper twist, cut the length of fabric you needed from the bolt with scissors, measured your nails by the pound. It was a personal transaction between human beings who knew each other, who had in many cases known each other their whole lives. And here is the part that I think reveals something profound about how commerce actually worked in the pre-industrial rural economy, because it was not commerce in the way we understand it today. Most farm families in the 1800s did not have steady cash. Cash arrived in the autumn when crops were sold, or when pigs were slaughtered and the surplus sold, or when something of the farm's production found a buyer at market. In between those moments, which is to say for most of the year, the family survived on what their land produced, and on the extension of credit from a single human being, the storekeeper. Farmers could purchase on credit, sometimes for an entire year, recording the transaction in the storekeeper's ledger book, and settle the account when harvest money finally arrived in the fall. This was not a formal banking system. It was a relationship. It was the storekeeper's personal judgment about which families were reliable, which farms were well managed, which families could be trusted to pay when the corn was sold. And it was, for hundreds of thousands of American farm families, the thing that stood between them and genuine hardship when a crop failed, a horse went lame, or a baby arrived at an inconvenient moment. But the credit ran in both directions, because the farm also supplied the store. Have you ever thought about how a small-town storekeeper in 1850 maintained inventory when there were no trucks, no telephone orders, no internet, and the nearest wholesale supplier was perhaps 100 miles away by wagon or canal boat? The answer was that the community itself became part of the supply chain. Farm women brought eggs to the store, dozens at a time, collected over the week, and received credit toward their account or trade for goods. They brought butter, churned at home, packed into crocks. They brought surplus produce, cabbages, turnips, dried beans, dried corn. They brought whatever the farm had produced in excess of what the family needed. The storekeeper accepted these goods, recorded them in his ledger, and either resold them locally or, in many cases, shipped them to dealers in larger towns. A study of general store accounts from the period at the Henry Ford Museum found that sugar was the single most commonly purchased item across all customers. That one fact tells a story about the 1800s diet that I find quietly fascinating. Not meat, not flour, not salt, all of which could be produced on most farms, but sugar. Pure, refined sugar, which required a tropical climate, plantation labour, and a global trade network to produce, and which no Ohio farm family could grow for themselves. Sugar was the thing that connected the self-sufficient farm family, however tenuously, to the wider world. And it was not just sugar. Let me tell you about coffee for a moment, because coffee in the early 1800s was not the convenient, ubiquitous, always available product it is today. It was imported. It was expensive relative to what a farm family earned, and it had to be processed at home. The green, unroasted beans purchased from the general store, roasted in a dry iron pan over the kitchen fire until they darkened and began to smell like the coffee we know, then ground each morning in a small hand mill. The ritual of roasting and grinding coffee was a daily act in households that could afford it, and the smell of it, that particular unmistakable smell of coffee, being roasted on a cast iron pan in the early morning, filling a kitchen that was otherwise cold and dark, was, For families across America in the 1800s, the smell of a small luxury, of something that cost real money, that came from across an ocean, that connected an Ohio farmhouse to Brazil and Java and wherever else the world's coffee grew. Tea carried a similar weight, though with different cultural associations. After the Boston Tea Party of 1773 and the revolution that followed, coffee had gained enormous symbolic importance as the patriotic American alternative to British tea. This cultural shift, from tea to coffee as the morning beverage of the American identity, happened quickly and durably, and it was cemented through the general store and the kitchen fire of millions of ordinary families who made the choice each morning when they filled the grinding mill. Now, vanilla, in my research for this series, there is one historical detail that stops me every time, because it is both surprising and revealing in equal measure. A historian writing about domestic life in Ohio in the early 1800s noted that most Americans had never tasted vanilla, not because it did not exist, but because it grew only in Mexico, required hand pollination by skilled workers to produce commercially, and was extraordinarily expensive to import. By the mid-1800s, pure vanilla extract was available in general stores, but only in the quantities that the wealthy could afford to buy regularly, or that ordinary families might purchase once, carefully, for something genuinely special. In 1865, the record shows that chocolate ice cream was served as the dessert at President Abraham Lincoln's inaugural dinner. The historical footnote that accompanied this detail observed that many Americans of that era had never tasted either chocolate or vanilla in their pure forms, that these flavors, which today are among the most ordinary and universal in American life, were in the 1800s still exotic, still expensive, still associated with the wider world beyond the farm. That observation shifted something for me, because we tend to think of the world before supermarkets as simpler, more limited, more cut off, and in some ways it was. But it was also a world where encountering a new flavour, really encountering it for the first time without having smelled a version of it in everything from a candle to a shampoo bottle, was an event. Where tasting chocolate for the first time was genuinely extraordinary, where the arrival of a new spice at the general store might represent the furthest a family had ever travelled, not in miles but in sensory experience. The general store was also something else, something that the purely commercial description does not capture. It was the town's information centre. In the years before telephones, before radio, before reliable newspapers reached rural areas, the general store was where news arrived. The storekeeper, who received shipments from the wider world, who entertained travelling salesmen who'd been everywhere and seen everything, who read the occasional newspaper that arrived with the supply wagon, he was, in many communities, one of the best-informed people for miles, and he shared what he knew. Men gathered around the potbelly stove in winter, arguing politics, discussing crop prices, relaying news of floods and elections and railroad routes in adjacent counties. Women compared notes on preserving methods, on children's ailments, on the relative merits of different varieties of seed. Community meetings were held in some stores, political rallies, church gatherings, when no church building existed. The first telephone in many small American towns appeared in the general store because that was where people already gathered and where information already flowed. Christmas was the general store's annual moment of genuine magic, or as close to magic as the 1800s got. Accounts from the period described the stores in December stocked with oranges and coconuts, items that had no other time of year when they appeared, that travelled from Florida and the Caribbean specifically for the holiday season. Bags of nuts, peppermint sticks, small toys. For families who lived in genuine isolation for most of the year, The December trip to the general store was not just an errand. It was the closest thing to abundance they encountered. One account describes a poor family's Christmas haul from a general store in the 1850s. A few pieces of penny candy and a single orange shared among the children. The orange, this account notes, was shared carefully. One piece for each child, the rinds pressed to noses and inhaled, the smell kept as long as possible before it faded. That orange, travelled from Florida or the Caribbean to rural Ohio or Virginia, represents something I find genuinely moving about the general store and the world it served. It was not abundance, it was not convenience, it was contact, brief, precious, expensive contact with the larger world. With the idea that beyond the fields and the seasons and the root cellar and the smokehouse, there was something else, something sweet and warm and fragrant that came from somewhere else, that tasted nothing like February. The general store's reign over rural American life lasted roughly from the early 1800s until the late 19th century, when it began to be gradually displaced, first by mail-order catalogues, then by improved roads and the automobile, and ultimately by the supermarket. The mail-order catalogue deserves its own acknowledgement, because it represented something quietly revolutionary in the story of how Americans ate. When the Sears Roebuck catalogue began reaching rural households in the 1893, families who had previously been limited to whatever a local storekeeper chose to stock could suddenly browse thousands of products. The reach of the catalogue was staggering. By 1910, Sears was distributing more than 10 million copies per year. For a farm family in Kansas or Mississippi or Montana, it was the first real encounter with consumer choice, with the idea that the market was not just whatever the storekeeper happened to carry, but something vast and various and accessible by mail. That catalogue, and the rural free delivery postal service that carried it, were, in retrospect, the first tremors of the earthquake that would, in the 20th century, produce the modern supermarket. The beginning of the separation of food from place, from community, from the particular knowledge of a storekeeper who knew your family and your land and your credit. I want to leave you with one more detail from the general store era before we move on, because it speaks to something that is both very old and very current. In a study of the relationship between general stores and their communities, historians note that the store's credit system was intensely personal. The storekeeper did not use a credit score. He did not consult a financial database. He used his knowledge of you, of your family, your farm, your history of keeping your word. If your father had always paid his debts, that fact weighed in your favor. If your neighbor had vouched for your character, that mattered. If the storekeeper had watched you work and knew how you handled your land, he made his assessment from that. The system was imperfect and could be exploited, as any personal system can be. But it also meant that the storekeeper had real skin in the game. His livelihood depended on making good judgments about who to trust, and because he lived in the same community, attended the same church, had his own family to feed, he had every reason to get it right. There is something in that, in the idea of commerce built on personal knowledge and community accountability rather than anonymous data, that I think people who are rediscovering farmers' markets and local food systems today would recognize immediately. But the general store, for all its richness and community, was still part of a world that was fundamentally changing. The same forces that made the railroad possible, industrialization, urbanization, the concentration of production and distribution, were, by the latter decades of the 1800s, beginning to transform food in ways that went beyond anything that had come before. The world was moving toward a place where food would be manufactured, not grown, where it would be made in factories, not kitchens, where the connection between the person who ate and the person or place that produced it would become not just attenuated but invisible. That transformation and the extraordinary, sometimes wonderful, sometimes troubling foods it produced is where we are headed next. The Civil War did something to the American stomach that no one had quite planned. Between 1861 and 1865, roughly 2.5 million Union soldiers were issued rations that included a new and somewhat suspicious item: food in a sealed metal tin. For most of these men, farmers, factory workers, store clerks, teachers, men who had eaten what their families grew or their neighborhoods produced for their entire lives, canned food was a novelty so strange that many of them regarded it with genuine suspicion. A tin of peaches, a can of condensed milk, a sealed container of oysters or tomatoes that claimed to have been preserved months before, far away, by people they had never met. Some of them hated it, but many of them ate it. And something quietly important happened in that transaction between hungry soldiers and industrial food. An entire generation of American men learned, for the first time, that food could travel, that it could sit on a shelf for months and still be edible, that the connection between the moment of production and the moment of eating, which had for all of human history been close, local, personal, could be stretched across time and space to a degree that would have seemed miraculous to their grandparents. When those men came home from the war, they brought that knowledge with them. The canning industry in America had been growing since the 1840s, but its scale before the Civil War was modest. In 1860, American factories were producing approximately 5 million cans of food per year. A decade later, in 1870, that number had risen to 30 million. By 1904, it was 290 million. Think about the speed of that. In 44 years, production grew nearly 60-fold. What drove it was not just the soldiers who came home hungry for convenience, it was the city. The explosive growth of American cities in the decades following the war created a class of people who had no garden, no root cellar, no smokehouse, no way of preserving their own food, and who were working 12-hour shifts in factories that left them no time for the elaborate domestic labor of putting up the harvest. They lived in apartments without cellars. As central heating was installed in more and more urban buildings through the 1870s and 80s, even the families who had previously kept some food in a cool basement found that the same furnaces that kept them warm in winter made that storage option unreliable. For these families, and by 1880 they numbered in the millions, commercial canned food was not a novelty. It was a lifeline. Henry Heinz is a name most people know today primarily because of a condiment, but the story of how Henry Heinz built his company in Pittsburgh in the 1870s and 80s is actually a story about something much larger. The moment when an entrepreneur looked at the rapidly urbanizing American landscape and understood, with genuine clarity, that the food of the future was going to come from factories rather than from farms. Heinz had grown up in Pittsburgh in the 1850s and 60s, watching the city grow around him. He understood that city families were increasingly buying foods they had previously made at home, and he went into business to provide them, not just with ketchup, though that would become his most famous product, but with pickles, horseradish sauce, canned vegetables, and eventually dozens of other preserved and bottled goods. What distinguished Heinz from many of his contemporaries was his obsession with cleanliness and consistency, which was unusual in an era when food manufacturing had essentially no regulation. The Heinz factory in Pittsburgh in the 1890s mandated weekly nail inspections for workers, required regular bathing, and insisted on standards of hygiene that the surrounding culture considered eccentric and frankly excessive. Workers who had never been asked to wash their hands before handling food at home were required to shower and change their work clothes at the Heinz plant. This was not altruism. It was brand management. Heinz had understood something that most food producers of the era had not yet grasped. In a world where the consumer could not see how their food was made and could not personally know or trust the person who made it, the way they had trusted the storekeeper, the neighbor, the family, the only thing that stood between a company and disaster was reputation. And reputation, in the food business, could be destroyed overnight by a single contaminated batch. But it was a different man, building a different kind of factory in a different city, who produced what I consider the most remarkable pivot in the entire history of how Americans ate. His name was John Harvey Kellogg, and the story of how he accidentally invented the modern breakfast is genuinely one of the strangest stories in American food history. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg ran a sanitarium, a health resort, in Battle Creek, Michigan, beginning in the 1870s. The sanitarium was run according to the principles of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which advocated, among other things, a strictly vegetarian diet, abstinence from alcohol and tobacco and coffee, and a general philosophy that the body was a temple that needed to be managed with great care and discipline. The wealthy industrialists who came to Battle Creek for recuperation arrived expecting the kind of substantial, meat-heavy breakfasts that were normal for their class in the 1880s. Fried steak and eggs, sausages, potatoes, biscuits, strong coffee. What they found instead was a vegetarian regimen designed to be as bland and unstimulating as possible. Based on Kellogg's sincere belief that mild, simple food suppressed problematic urges and promoted digestive health, Kellogg began experimenting with ways to make grain-based foods interesting enough that his patients would actually eat them. He tried boiling wheat into a soft dough, then rolling it out thin. And one evening, the story goes, and this detail has been told and retold enough that I suspect the specifics may be somewhat embellished. But the essential truth of the accident is well documented. A batch of cooked wheat was left sitting too long before it could be rolled. It had gone slightly stale, slightly dry. When Kellogg and his brother William rolled it out anyway, instead of producing the smooth, continuous sheet they intended, it broke into individual flakes. They baked those flakes. The result was something they had never made before. Something light, crisp, easy to digest, and, with a little sugar, actually pleasant to eat. By 1895, Kellogg had a patent and was producing cornflakes commercially. Within a few years, there were 40 competing manufacturers in the Battle Creek area alone. By 1911, the city that would come to be known as the cereal capital of the world was hosting 107 brands of cornflakes. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating about the cereal story, and I think it is a detail worth pausing on. John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes as a health food. He believed, with complete sincerity, that a plain, bland, unsweetened grain flake would calm the nervous system, aid digestion, and promote the kind of quiet, temperate life that he considered morally superior to the meat-heavy, coffee-fueled, industrially distracted life of Gilded Age America. His brother William had different ideas. William Kellogg, who had worked as his brother's unpaid assistant for years while John took all the credit, broke away in 1906, bought the rights to the cornflakes formula, founded his own company, and made one change that his brother had specifically forbidden. He added sugar. Then he advertised, and the product that John Harvey Kellogg had invented as a quiet instrument of moral improvement became, in William's hands, one of the most commercially successful food products in American history. Not because it was morally improving, because it tasted good, it was convenient, and it could be marketed with a boldness and creativity that the earlier food world, the world of the general store and the root cellar, had never imagined possible. Can you think of any irony richer than that? The man who wanted to suppress indulgence created one of the most heavily sweetened and heavily advertised products in the history of American food the moment he lost control of it. The Campbell's soup story is another one that I find quietly extraordinary, because it represents a different kind of industrial food genius. For generations, soup in America had been homemade, a long-simmered pot on the back of the stove built from bones and vegetables and whatever the kitchen offered. It was labour-intensive, it was time-consuming, and it was deeply personal. The soup of a particular family's kitchen, tasting of their stock and their garden and their particular way of seasoning things. In 1897, a chemist named John Dorrance joined the Joseph Campbell Company in Camden, New Jersey, and proposed something simple. Remove the water. Commercial canned soups at the time were full liquid, which made them extraordinarily expensive to ship. You were paying rail freight on the water content, which represented most of the weight. Condensed soup, a thick concentrate that the consumer would reconstitute at home with a can of water, cut shipping costs dramatically, and made canned soup affordable for ordinary working-class families for the first time. Sales of Campbell's condensed soups rose from 500,000 cans in 1900 to 18 million cans by the early 1920s. A product that had been entirely homemade for the whole of human history had, within a single generation, become something you opened from a tin. And here is the bigger story that all of these individual stories are telling, because I think it is worth naming directly. The canning factories and the cereal mills and the condensed soup companies were not just producing food, they were fundamentally restructuring the relationship between human beings and the food they ate. For the first time in history it was possible, and for millions of urban Americans increasingly normal, to eat food that had been made by strangers, in factories, in places you had never visited, using processes you did not understand, from ingredients whose origin you could not trace. The knowledge that had previously been embedded in the act of eating, the knowledge of season, of method, of source, of the specific soil and specific hands that had produced the meal, was not just becoming optional. For the urban apartment dweller buying a can of Campbell's soup in 1910, it was structurally unavailable. You could not ask the factory how it made the soup. You could not know the farm where the tomatoes had grown. You trusted the label, the brand, the company's reputation, just as Arthur Hill Hassel's investigations had revealed that such trust was frequently misplaced, and just as the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906 had just begun, imperfectly and incompletely, to put a flaw under that trust. There is a detail about the early breakfast cereal advertising campaigns that I think captures this moment of transition with particular clarity. By the early 1900s, companies like Kellogg and Post were not just selling cereal. They were selling a way of thinking about breakfast, a way of thinking about health, convenience, and the relationship between food and the modern schedule. Kellogg's famous slogan, "Breakfast is the most important meal of the day," was not a nutritional finding. It was an advertising claim, introduced in 1917 to increase cereal consumption, and it worked so thoroughly that most Americans today still believe it is a settled scientific fact, rather than a marketing invention. That is, I think, the most telling detail in all of food history. The industrial food system did not just change what people ate, it changed what people believed about eating. It made the narrative of food something that companies could write, and that consumers would internalize as truth. What does this mean for the story of the 1800s that we've been telling? It means that the century began with a world where almost everyone grew or personally knew the origin of what they ate, where food was local, seasonal, personal, and embedded in specific communities and landscapes. And it ended with the first tremors of a world where food was manufactured, anonymous, nationally distributed, and narrated by advertising. The root cellar and the smokehouse and the salt barrel and the jar of mason-canned peaches were not replaced overnight. In most American households, even well into the 20th century, they coexisted alongside the new commercial products. Your grandmother might have been canning her own tomatoes in the summer, while also opening a can of Campbell's soup on a Tuesday evening, when there was no time for the real thing. But the direction of travel was clear, and with it came a question that we are, I think, still working out. What do we lose when we lose the knowledge of where our food comes from? When the act of eating is separated from the act of producing, not by the distance of a root cellar, but by the distance of a factory floor in a state you have never visited, making a product whose ingredients list you cannot quite pass. That question does not have a clean answer. The industrial food system brought real abundance, real convenience, real relief from the labour and anxiety that had dominated life for the people, whose stories we've been tracing through this whole journey. The woman who no longer had to spend all of August over a canning pot was free to do other things with her August. That freedom was real, but something was also lost. Something about attention, about knowledge, about the intimate connection between the particular human body and the particular piece of land that had sustained it. We are approaching the end of our journey through the 1800s, and the question of what people ate before the modern world arrived. And I want to spend our remaining time not just looking at what was lost in the transition toward industrial food, but at something surprising that happened. Something that none of the industrialists or advertisers or food scientists of the late 19th century had planned for. It turns out that a handful of the foods people ate in the 1800s, foods that were created entirely out of hardship, necessity, and limited ingredients, turned out to be so extraordinarily good that they have survived not just into our century, but into the menus of the finest restaurants in the world. The foods of necessity that became the foods of desire, and the story of how that happened, how poverty and ingenuity together produce some of the most celebrated flavors in American and European cuisine, is where we're going next. There is a moment I want you to hold in your mind as we begin this final stretch of our journey. It is sometime around 1876. A writer named John Rowan is travelling along the coast of New England, and he stops to record an observation. He writes, matter-of-factly, that in this part of the world, lobster shells about a house are looked upon as signs of poverty and degradation. Let that sentence breathe for just a second. Lobster. The food that today costs more per pound than almost any other protein on a restaurant menu. The food that is the centerpiece of the most expensive items on menus, from Boston to Paris to Hong Kong. The food that people save up for, order on anniversaries, photograph with their phones before eating it. In 1876, finding lobster shells near your house was a sign that your family was too poor to afford real food, and lobster is not the only one. The story of how the food of poverty and desperation became the food of desire and celebration is, I think, one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in all of food history. It is a story about scarcity, about ingenuity, about the alchemy that happens when talented cooks are given almost nothing to work with and told to make it edible, and what happens when the wider world finally tastes what they made. Let me start with the lobster, because the story is genuinely remarkable in its specificity. In colonial New England, lobsters were so abundant that after storms they would wash up on the beaches in piles 2 feet deep, literally stacked on the sand there for the taking. The governor of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford, recorded his shame in 1622 when the only food the settlement could offer newly arrived colonists was lobster, served without bread, without butter, with nothing but a cup of fair water. He was embarrassed. This was not hospitality. This was the food of last resort, For the next 200 years that perception held. Lobsters were fed to prisoners, to servants, to livestock. They were used as fertilizer, piled onto fields to enrich soil. In Massachusetts, the story goes, and historians debate whether this is literally true or has been somewhat embellished over time, indentured servants negotiated to have it written into their contracts that they would not be fed lobster more than 3 times a week. Not because lobster was too good for servants, but because it was considered demeaning to be made to eat it so frequently. The lobster in the 1800s was the cockroach of the American seafood world. And then the railroad arrived. Here is what actually happened, and it is one of the most fascinating case studies in how perception is shaped not by the thing itself, but by the story surrounding it. When railroad companies began expanding their lines west in the 1850s and 60s, they needed food to serve to passengers. Lobster was extraordinarily cheap along the coast and easy to can. Railroad catering managers started serving it as if it were something novel and exciting, because for the inland passengers who had never seen one, it was. These were people from Ohio and Indiana and Missouri who had no idea that back on the Maine coast, lobster shells were a mark of shame. They tasted it. They loved it. They asked for it after they got home. And here is where the economics take over. As demand from inland cities increased, as fresh lobster began to be shipped rather than just canned, as supply, being over-harvested, as it always is once something becomes desirable, began to fall, the price climbed. Restaurants began serving it. Chefs discovered that lobster cooked live tasted dramatically better than lobster that had been killed first. Elaborate preparations, lobster Newburg, then lobster Thermidor, appeared on upscale menus in New York and Boston. By the 1920s, lobster prices had reached their first peak. The transformation from garbage food to luxury item had taken roughly 60 years. What I find most striking about the lobster story is not the transformation itself, but its mechanism. It was not that lobster became better. It was that people who had no negative memory of lobster, who had never grown up knowing it as the food of poverty, who had only ever encountered it as something fresh and novel and slightly exotic, were the ones who decided its value. The inland passengers on the railroad could not see the 2-foot piles of shells on the New England beaches. They could only taste what was in front of them. Now let me tell you about oysters, because the oyster story runs almost exactly parallel, though with a slightly different timing and a particularly New York character. We talked earlier in our journey about how oysters in the mid-1800s were the street food of the urban working class, sold from barrels at every corner, eaten raw by factory workers and street vendors and dock hands for a penny a dozen. They were the protein of poverty, the food that New York Harbor produced in such extraordinary abundance that they were essentially inexhaustible. Inexhaustible, that is, until they were exhausted. By the 1880s, the combined effects of overharvesting, industrial pollution, and the landfill that was literally burying large portions of New York Harbor had destroyed the great oyster beds. What had once been so abundant that it was practically given away was now scarce. And scarcity, as the lobster story had already demonstrated, is the first ingredient of luxury. As oysters became harder to find, chefs began treating them with the reverence that only comes from limited supply. Ice, which by the 1870s was becoming commercially available in cities thanks to the ice trade we discussed earlier, made it possible to serve oysters truly cold and fresh in restaurants. The raw bar was invented. Presentation became elaborate. Specialized oyster plates appeared. Dishes with 4 to 6 shell-shaped indentations, designed to hold each oyster in perfect position. The act of eating an oyster became, slowly, a ritual rather than a refueling. The same food that a dock worker had slurped from a bucket in 1840 was, by 1900, being served on silver platters in the dining rooms of the Plaza Hotel. But the most extraordinary story of all, and the one that I come back to again and again because it represents something so much larger than just food, is not about lobster or oysters. It is about the foods that came out of the kitchens I described earlier in our journey. The kitchens of the enslaved and the kitchens of the poor. Think about gumbo. Gumbo is, in the world's finest Creole and Cajun restaurants today, one of the most celebrated dishes in American cuisine. It is complex, deeply flavored, built from a careful sequence of technique. The roux that must be stirred for 30 or 40 minutes until it reaches exactly the right color, the perfect shade between gold and dark brown, before a single drop of liquid touches it. The layering of vegetables, the precise moment when the seafood goes in so it does not overcook. Chefs spend years mastering it. But its origins are not in a cooking school. They're in the kitchens of enslaved people in Louisiana, women who combined the rice cooking knowledge brought from West Africa, the okra of their homeland. The very word gumbo comes from a Bantu word for okra, the indigenous Choctaw practice of using ground-dried sassafras leaves as a thickener called filet, and the French colonial technique of starting a dish with a flour and fat roux. They made this dish from whatever was available, from the scraps, from the things that no one else wanted. The same story is true of jambalaya, which bears a direct kinship to the West African dish of rice and beans that was brought across the Atlantic and adapted to the ingredients of Louisiana. True of Hoppin' John, rice and black-eyed peas, a dish that food historian Jessica B. Harris traces directly to a Senegalese original called shebu niebe, made with rice and beef. True of the entire canon of what we now call barbecue. Let me talk about barbecue for a moment, because I think its history is deeply misunderstood, and because the truth of it is so much more interesting than the mythology. American barbecue, slow cooking meat over wood smoke for hours, tending the fire through the night, developing the deep bark and tender interior that no other cooking method can produce, is not a technique that emerged from backyard cookouts. It emerged from the work of enslaved people on southern plantations who were assigned, among other tasks, the responsibility of preparing meat for the plantation's extended community. A former enslaved man named Wesley Jones from South Carolina gave historians a recipe for vinegar-based barbecue sauce that he had learned as an enslaved person: black pepper, red pepper, and vinegar, basted onto the meat as it cooked over the fire. He described staying up through the night to tend the fire, slow cooking the meat hour after hour, turning and basting. That vinegar-pepper combination, adapted and varied by region, enriched and complicated by generations of cooks, is still recognizable today as the base of North and South Carolina barbecue. The $400 Wagyu brisket served at the most expensive barbecue restaurants in Austin and Nashville traces its lineage, directly and without interruption, to the techniques developed by enslaved cooks who were given the cheap cuts, the cuts no one else wanted, and made them extraordinary through skill, patience, and the willingness to sit with fire for 12 hours until the collagen had dissolved and the meat had transformed into something no knife was necessary to eat. Now here is the question I want to ask you directly, because I think it is worth sitting with honestly. How is it possible that the same foods, created out of poverty, out of limitation, out of the most constrained circumstances imaginable, became not just acceptable but celebrated? How does the food of the desperate become the food of the connoisseur? The answer, I think, has multiple threads, and they are not all equally comfortable. One thread is simply that good food is good food, and that the techniques and flavors developed by people working with limited ingredients are often genuinely superior to the techniques developed by people with limitless resources. Slow cooking is better than fast cooking. The secondary cuts of meat, the ones that require patience and skill, often yield more complex flavour than the premium cuts. The layering of spices and the balancing of vinegar against fat and the long cooking of greens in smoked pork liquor. These produce flavours that cannot be shortcutted, cannot be bought, can only be learned and practiced and passed down. A second thread is scarcity. Once the oyster beds were depleted, once the lobsters were being fished out, once the specific foods that had been plentiful became rare, their value inverted. The economics of scarcity turned subsistence food into luxury food with a speed that no one had planned. A third thread is uncomfortable, and I think it deserves to be named. The same society that denied the cooks who created these dishes credit, recognition, or compensation, that took the labour and knowledge of enslaved people and gave nothing in return, benefited enormously from their culinary genius. The cuisine that came out of the kitchens of the enslaved was adopted, adapted, celebrated, and commercialized by a culture that rarely named the source. The first African-American cookbook, a pamphlet self-published by a woman named Melinda Russell in 1866, went almost entirely unacknowledged by the mainstream culinary world. The cooking techniques of barbecue were practiced and perfected in plantation kitchens for generations before white pitmaster entrepreneurs began winning awards for them in the 20th century. Gumbo and jambalaya and Hoppin' John entered Southern cuisine without a genealogy that reached back to the women who invented them. That does not diminish the food, but it should be part of how we understand it. Here is what I keep returning to, and what I want to leave you with as we approach the final chapter of this journey. The entire arc of the 1800s and the food that people made before the modern world arrived points toward a single, recurring truth. That necessity is not just the mother of invention, but the mother of art. That the most extraordinary flavours in our shared culinary heritage came not from abundance, but from its absence. Not from chefs in well-equipped kitchens with every ingredient available, but from cooks who had to figure out how to make the tough cut tender, how to season the bland piece of pork into something worth tasting, how to stretch a handful of cornmeal and a few black-eyed peas into a meal that tasted not just adequate but genuinely, deeply good. The root cellar and the smokehouse produced flavours that the supermarket cannot replicate. The slow-cooked gumbo and the vinegar-basted barbecue and the pot liquor from collard greens. These came from kitchens where waste was impossible, where every scrap had to work, where skill and creativity were the only currency available. There is something in that which speaks to the present moment. Not a romantic call to return to a world without refrigerators or grocery stores. That world was also a world of real hunger and real hardship, but a recognition that the relationship between constraint and creativity is not a coincidence. That some of the most beautiful things come from the places where necessity left no room for anything but ingenuity. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the farmhouse hearth of 1820 to the canning factory of 1890, from the salt barrel to the breakfast cereal box, from the lobster piles on the New England beaches to the silver platters of Gilded Age restaurants. And through all of it, running underneath every salt-cured ham and every mason jar of summer peaches and every bowl of slow-cooked gumbo, a question that the people of the 1800s lived inside without quite having words for. A question that we are now, a century and a half later, beginning to ask out loud again. What do we owe the food we eat? What do we owe the people who grew it, made it, invented it? And what did the world lose? And what did it gain on the day the first supermarket opened its doors and changed the answer to both questions forever? That final chapter is the last stop on tonight's journey, and it is just a breath away. On the morning of September the 6th, 1916, A man named Clarence Saunders unlocked the door of a small store at 79 Jefferson Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. He stepped back. He waited. The store looked nothing like any grocery store anyone in Memphis had ever seen. There were no clerks standing behind a counter ready to take your list and collect your items. There were no familiar rituals of handing a slip of paper to a man who knew where everything was and would bring it to you. Instead, there were shelves. Open shelves, running the length of 4 aisles, stocked with 605 items, each one priced and labelled. There was a basket to carry. There were turnstiles at the entrance and the exit. And there was, for the first time in the history of food retail, the invitation to simply go in, walk through, choose for yourself. Saunders called it a self-service store. He had recently filed a patent for the concept. He was, by most accounts, a flamboyant and somewhat chaotic man. He would later lose the store in a Wall Street maneuver he had not fully thought through, and the pink marble mansion he was building with his profits would become a museum. But on that September morning, what he had created was something genuinely new. It was the first supermarket, and without knowing it, Clarence Saunders had completed the long journey that we've been tracing together tonight. The journey from the farm, where 90% of Americans grew their own food in 1790, to the store. From the root cellar and the smokehouse and the salt barrel to the open shelf and the printed label in the checkout lane. The century was over. The modern world had arrived. Let me tell you what the first Piggly Wiggly actually looked like inside, because I find it genuinely touching in its specificity. Customers entered through a turnstile and walked a single prescribed path through all 4 aisles. There were no shortcuts, no backtracking. Saunders had designed the layout so that every shopper would pass every product in the store. He had positioned candy and small impulse items near the exit, near the cashier, which is, as any food marketing professor will tell you today, the origin of every candy bar display at every checkout lane you've ever seen in your life. The products had to sell themselves. There was no clerk to recommend the better pickle brand or to tell you that the flour on the 3rd shelf was fresher than the flour on the 2nd. You read the label, you made the choice, and in that moment, in that small, quiet revolution of the individual shopper standing alone before an open shelf, the entire relationship between a person and their food changed. That meant consumers could make decisions as to what it was they wanted to buy, a food marketing professor reflected a century later, and that really led to companies trying to catch consumers' attention. It's really the origin of branding. The origin of branding. The moment when food became not just sustenance but signal, not just nourishment but identity. Not just what you needed, but what the label told you that you were. Now I want to take a step back from the store and hold the whole arc of this century we have travelled through tonight, because I think there is something worth seeing in the full shape of it. In 1800, most Americans were farmers. They knew where every item on their table came from because they had grown it, raised it, preserved it, or traded with a neighbour who had. The relationship between a person and their food was one of the most intimate and labour-intensive relationships in their lives. It shaped their days, their seasons, their fears, their gratitude. By 1916, a person could walk into a store in Memphis, Tennessee, pick up a basket, walk through 4 aisles, pay at the register, and leave with food that had been grown by strangers, processed by factories, transported by railroads, packaged by machinery, priced by clerks, and know almost nothing about any of it beyond what it said on the label. That is not 100 years of simple progress. That's a profound transformation in what it means to be a human being in relationship with the food that sustains you. Some of what was gained in that transformation was real and irreplaceable. The woman who no longer had to spend all of August canning in a sweltering kitchen had time she had not had before. The city family who could open a can of tomatoes in February was eating something their grandparents would have considered almost miraculous. the expanding variety of food, the California orange in the Ohio winter, the Chicago beef in the New York tenement, the canned fish in the Kansas prairie town, gave people access to nutrition and flavor that the old, bounded local food world had denied them. But something was also lost, and I think the people who lived through the transition felt it, even if they could not name it clearly. There is a line from a food historian reflecting on the shift that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that I have thought about a great deal. She wrote that as the food supply chain became larger and more complex, the direct relationships between consumers and local farmers were largely lost. Not entirely, not immediately, but gradually, structurally, irreversibly, and people noticed. As early as 1914, before Piggly Wiggly had opened its doors, President Woodrow Wilson's administration launched a program called Farm to Table, designed to help rural farmers ship their produce directly to city dwellers by parcel post. The program was explicitly a response to the growing distance between the people who grew food and the people who ate it. In 1915 and 1916, American restaurants began appearing that advertised their local sourcing, places that promised produce delivered from their own farm, meat from animals they had raised themselves, bread baked from grain they'd grown. "Farm to face," read one Harrisburg, Pennsylvania restaurant slogan. The longing for connection to the source was already visible, even as the source was becoming harder to find. That longing never fully disappeared. It went underground during the Depression and the wars, when abundance and convenience were the urgent priorities, and no one had the luxury of worrying about where the canned beans came from. It re-emerged in the 1960s and 70s with the counterculture's return to the land, with organic farming, with backyard gardens, with the community food cooperatives that opened in college towns across America. And it's visible again today in the farmers' markets and the community-supported agriculture programs and the farm-to-table restaurants and the resurgent interest in home canning and bread baking and the cultivation of kitchen gardens, in the people who want to know the name of the farm where their chicken grew up, in the chefs who build menus around what is ripe in the fields this week rather than what can be sourced year-round from a global supply chain. What I find genuinely moving about this recurring pattern, this oscillation between the convenience of the industrial food system and the hunger for something more direct, more known, more personally connected, is that it suggests the people of the 1800s understood something that we're still working to articulate. They understood it not in philosophical terms, not in the language of food movements or sustainability rhetoric, but in the specific embodied knowledge of daily life. They understood it when a woman spent 6 hours canning peaches in August so that her family could open a jar in February and taste, in the middle of winter, the particular sweetness of a fruit that had grown 50 feet from her kitchen door. She was not thinking about food systems or local sourcing. She was thinking about her family eating well through the cold months. But the act itself encoded something, a relationship between a specific place, specific hands, specific knowledge, and the food on a specific table, that no supermarket shelf could quite replicate. They understood it when a farmer's family made an all-day trip to the general store and came home with coffee beans and a paper twist of cinnamon and a few sticks of peppermint candy, small luxuries that connected an isolated Ohio farm to Brazil and Ceylon and the Caribbean, carried through a global trade network and delivered by a man who knew their name and their credit history and their children's ages. Commerce as community, transaction as relationship. They understood it in the kitchen where an enslaved woman cooked for a family that owned her, and then in the evening took the scraps and the cornmeal and the fatback and made something for her own community that tasted, despite everything, like dignity and care and the specific genius of people who had nothing to work with but their knowledge and their hands. All of these things were lost or diminished in the shift to the modern food system. And all of them are, in various ways, the things that the farm-to-table movement and the slow food movement and the home canning revival and the sourdough pandemic baking craze are, however imperfectly, trying to recover. Here is what I want to leave you with. At the end of this very long journey through the kitchens and the smokehouses and the root cellars and the general stores of the 1800s, the next time you open your refrigerator, which you will probably do 12 times tomorrow without thinking about it, I hope you see it a little differently. Not just as a convenience, but as the end of a very long chain of human ingenuity that stretches back through Gustavus Swift and his refrigerated railroad cars, through Nicholas Appert and his boiling pot of glass jars, through Frederick Tudor and his ships full of Massachusetts pond ice, through the women who packed tubs of salt in October, and the men who tended smokehouse fires through November nights, through the Irish families who ate potatoes morning and evening and prayed the harvest would hold, through the enslaved cooks who made extraordinary food from almost nothing, and whose descendants' recipes now sit at the top of the most prestigious restaurant menus in America. All of that is in your refrigerator. All of that is in the jar of pickles on your shelf, and the smoked salmon on your plate, and the bowl of soup you open from a can on a Tuesday evening when there is no time for anything more. The next time you eat something that tastes genuinely deeply good, not just convenient, not just adequate, but actually stop what you are doing, close your eyes good, think for a moment about the chain of necessity and ingenuity and love and stubbornness that produced it. Think about who made it and where and what constraints they were working within. Think about what they knew that we have forgotten and what they passed on to us that we are still carrying. We did not arrive at this table by accident. We got here on the backs of people who understood, with a clarity born of genuine necessity, that food is not just fuel. It is memory. It is culture. It is the most intimate possible connection between the people who grow things and the people who eat them. It is the taste of a particular season, on a particular piece of land, prepared by a particular pair of hands. The supermarket is a miracle, and the root cellar is a miracle too. And maybe what we need, in the age of everything being available at all times from everywhere at once, is to hold both of those truths at the same time. And that, my friends, is where we end tonight's journey. We have travelled from the smoke-stained hearthside of the early 1800s all the way to the very first supermarket door, through wars and harvests and terrible hunger and extraordinary abundance, through the ingenuity of people who had almost nothing and made everything, and through the warning stories of people who lost the thread of what food actually is when it became too easy to forget. I hope that tonight, as you settle in, as the quiet of the night surrounds you, you carry some small piece of this story with you into sleep, a piece of the smokehouse, a piece of the salt barrel, a piece of the woman whose hands knew, before science could explain it, exactly how much salt was enough to keep the winter away. Thank you, genuinely from the bottom of my heart, for spending these hours with me tonight. Listening to history with this kind of patience and openness is one of the most generous things a person can do. If this journey moved you, or surprised you, or made you look at your kitchen a little differently, then I am deeply grateful. And if you are still awake, which considering how long this has been is honestly impressive, please do leave a comment below and tell me which part of the story stayed with you the most. Was it the lobster piling up on New England beaches, the Ice King of Boston and his impossible ships, the woman packing tubs of salt in October? I would genuinely love to know. And just wait until you hear what's coming next, because this was only one story from a world that was full of them. The history of how people lived and ate and survived and created beauty out of hardship. that story has no ending. There's always another chapter, and I will be here, keeping the candle burning, ready to tell it. Sleep well tonight. You have earned it.